The night before her wedding, Celeste Mercer stood in a bathroom that cost more than most people's houses, pressing a cold razor blade against the lining of her suitcase, slicing open the silk to hide $3,000 in stolen cash. Her hands were shaking, her lipstick was perfect. And downstairs, 200 guests were already arriving for tomorrow's rehearsal dinner, clinking champagne glasses to celebrate a marriage that would slowly kill her. She wasn't being dramatic. She had the bruises to prove it. Faded yellow marks along her ribs where Damian Blackwood's fingers had dug in 6 days ago. If you think you know how this story ends, the runaway bride, the fairy tale escape, you don't. Because running was the easy part. What came after nearly destroyed her. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let me see just how far this story travels. This is the story of Celeste Mercer, and it starts with a lie. The dress cost $14,000. Celeste knew this because Damien's mother, Vivian Blackwood, had told her exactly once, in a tone that made it clear the number was both a gift and a leash. Italian lace, hand-stitched pearls along the bodice, a cathedral train that required 2 attendants to manage. It hung now in the guest suite of the Blackwood estate in Beacon Hill, suspended from a padded hanger like a body waiting to be claimed. Celeste stood in front of it at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in January, barefoot on cold marble, and felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. She felt plenty. She felt the dull ache along her left side where Damien had grabbed her last week during an argument about seating charts. She felt the tight knot behind her sternum that had lived there for approximately 14 months. Ever since the first time he'd locked her in a room and told her she wasn't leaving until she apologized for embarrassing him at his father's birthday dinner. She felt the specific, crawling kind of exhaustion that comes from smiling for so long your face forgets any other shape. What she didn't feel was anything resembling a bride. She touched the lace, cold under her fingers. She pulled her hand back. From down the hall came the low rumble of voices. Damien and his groomsmen in the study, drinking scotch that cost $80 a pour, laughing about something she'd never be told. She could hear Damien's voice above the others. He always spoke louder than anyone else in a room. Not shouting, exactly. Just occupying, filling every corner, leaving no air for anyone else. She turned away from the dress and caught her reflection in the window. 26 years old, dark hair pinned back. Thin. Thinner than she'd been a year ago, because stress ate her appetite and Damien preferred her slim anyway. She looked, she thought, like a woman posing for a portrait no one had asked for. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. She didn't look at it. It would be her mother, or one of Damien's sisters, or the wedding coordinator confirming something about flower arrangements. Everyone in her life had become a functionary of this wedding. Every conversation circled back to it. Table settings, vow drafts, first dance song selection. As if the ceremony were the point. As if what happened after didn't matter. Celeste sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her knees. She could still feel it, 6 days ago. His hand closing around her arm, hard enough that she'd gasped, and he'd said, "Don't be dramatic, Cel." The way he said her name like that, shortened, casual, as if even her name was his to edit. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't the 5th time. That was the problem. The problem wasn't any single moment. The problem was the accumulation, the way each incident was small enough to explain away, reasonable enough to doubt. He grabbed her arm. He didn't hit her. He raised his voice. He didn't scream. He locked her in a room, only for an hour. He checked her phone, only because he cared. Each excuse was a brick, and she'd been building a wall with them for over a year, a wall between herself and the truth she already knew but couldn't afford to say out loud. Damien Blackwood was not going to get better. He was going to get worse. And this wedding was the lock on a door that opened only from the outside. She heard footsteps in the hall, heavy, deliberate. Damien's walk. He moved like a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. She held her breath. The footsteps passed, kept going. She exhaled. This was her life now. Tracking footsteps, gauging moods from the weight of a stride, reading the angle of his jaw when he entered a room to determine whether tonight would be a good night or a careful one. She reached under the bed and pulled out the suitcase she'd hidden there 2 days ago. Small, brown leather. The kind of thing a woman might take on a weekend trip. Inside it, buried beneath a folded sweater and a pair of boots, was an envelope containing $3,200, cash she'd been siphoning from the household account for months, $20 and $50 at a time, always from grocery runs and small purchases Damien wouldn't audit. She told herself it was emergency money, just in case. A precaution. She knew better now. She'd known better for weeks. It wasn't emergency money, it was escape money. The question was whether she'd use it. She hadn't slept properly in 4 days. The rehearsal dinner was tomorrow evening. The ceremony was Saturday afternoon. 230 guests, the Blackwood family's Episcopal Church on Commonwealth Avenue, followed by a reception at the Liberty Hotel, followed by a honeymoon in Capri that Damien had planned without asking her opinion. Every detail locked in, confirmed, paid for. A machine with too much momentum to stop. Except, Celeste opened her laptop and pulled up the document she'd been staring at for 3 nights. A train schedule. Boston South Station to Chicago, connecting through to Cheyenne, Wyoming. She'd found it by accident, or not by accident, because nothing you search for at 2 in the morning while your fiancé sleeps in the next room is really an accident. She'd been reading about homesteaders, about women who'd gone west in the 1800s and carved lives out of nothing. She couldn't explain why the idea grabbed her. Maybe because it was the opposite of everything she knew. Maybe because west felt like a direction that didn't have Damien in it. Wyoming. She'd never been to Wyoming. She couldn't picture it. That was the point. She closed the laptop. This is insane, she told herself. You're not a character in a novel. You're a grown woman with a degree from Wellesley and a wedding in 48 hours. You don't disappear. That's not what people like you do. People like you. That phrase had been weaponized her whole life. People like you don't raise their voices. People like you marry well. People like you don't cause scenes. She'd been shaped by it, squeezed into a mold so tight she'd forgotten what shape she actually was. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked. A text from her mother. Vivian wants to confirm you'll wear the Cartier earrings. They were her mother's. It would mean so much. Celeste stared at this message. The Cartier earrings. Another leash dressed up as a gift. Another piece of the Blackwood family closing around her like a fist. She typed back, "Of course, they're beautiful." Then she set the phone face down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The thing nobody tells you about leaving is that there's no clean moment, no dramatic thunderclap that makes the decision obvious. Celeste had been waiting for that moment for months, the one undeniable event that would make everyone understand, that would justify walking away from everything. But life isn't a movie. The moment doesn't come gift-wrapped. It comes at 2 a.m. on a cold Thursday in January while you're sitting on a bed that belongs to someone else, in a house that belongs to someone else, wearing a ring that feels like a shackle. And you realize with a quiet, horrible clarity that if you go through with this, you will slowly become no one. Not violently, not all at once, just gradually. Damien would trim her edges, correct her opinions, monitor her friendships, manage her appearance. And she would let him, because by then she'd be his wife, and his wife meant his responsibility, and his responsibility meant his property, and she'd be so deep inside it that leaving would require an earthquake she no longer had the strength to create. She looked at the suitcase. She looked at the dress. She looked at her hands. "Okay," she said. To no one. To the room. To herself. She started packing. Okay. She moved through this Blackwood estate at 5:30 in the morning like a ghost. Stockinged feet on marble floors, suitcase in one hand, boots in the other. The house was a museum of wealth, oil paintings, crystal, mahogany, and it slept the way wealthy things sleep, heavily and without worry. The hardest part was the front door. The old brass latch was loud. She'd tested it 3 days ago, casually, during the afternoon when the house was busy. It clicked like a gunshot in the silence. She wrapped her scarf around the mechanism, muffled it, eased the door open an inch at a time. Cold air hit her face. January in Boston. 8 degrees. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill you, it judges you. She stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind her. For a moment, she stood there on the steps of the Blackwood estate, breath clouding in front of her, and felt the strangest emotion she'd experienced in months. It wasn't relief. It wasn't fear. It was blankness. A total absence of the constant, thrumming anxiety that had been her companion for over a year. as if the act of walking out the door had temporarily severed whatever wire connected her to the life she was leaving. It wouldn't last. She knew that. The fear would come. But for now, just for this one frozen moment, she was nothing and no one. And it was the most peace she'd felt since the first time Damien's grip left marks. She walked. South Station was 42 minutes on foot. She didn't take a cab because cabs could be traced, and she didn't take the T because the T had cameras. And maybe she was being paranoid, but paranoia had kept her alive this long, and she wasn't going to abandon it now. She walked through Beacon Hill in the dark, past brownstones and bare trees and parked cars wearing skins of ice, and she felt the city watching her with the indifferent gaze cities reserve for people who are leaving them. By the time she reached South Station, her toes were numb and her nose was running, and the first gray light of dawn was seeping through the clouds like a stain. She bought a ticket at the counter, cash. The man behind the glass barely looked at her. "Chicago connection?" he asked. "Cheyenne?" she said. "That's a long ride." "I know." He printed the ticket and slid it through the gap. She took it with fingers that shook, and not from the cold. Platform 7. The train was already boarding. She found her seat, coach, because $14,000 wedding dresses don't come with a practical budget for fleeing, and sat down next to a window that showed her own face reflected back at her, pale and wide-eyed, and looking, she thought, like someone who had just jumped off a building and hadn't hit the ground yet. The train lurched, moved. Boston slid sideways, then backward, then gone. Celeste pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. She was not going to cry. Not yet. There would be time for crying later. Right now, she needed to be a machine. She needed to get from point A to point B without thinking about what she'd left behind, because if she thought about it, really thought about it, she might get off at the next stop and go back. And going back was the one thing she absolutely could not do. So she sat there on a westbound train, wearing a wool coat over yesterday's clothes, with $3,200 and no plan, and she did what frightened people have done since the beginning of time. She stared forward and kept moving. There. The train took 39 hours. 39 hours is a long time to sit with a decision you can't undo. Long enough for the adrenaline to wear off and the second-guessing to begin. Long enough to check your phone 17 times before finally powering it off, because every buzz might be Damien and every silence might be worse. Long enough to eat 2 overpriced sandwiches from the cafe car and watch the country change outside the window. The gray density of the Northeast giving way to open farmland, then flat plains, then something emptier, wider, the land stretching out like it was trying to prove a point about how small one person really was. Celeste slept in bursts. 20 minutes here, an hour there. She woke each time with the same jolt of disorientation, the same half-second where she didn't know where she was, followed by the sickening rush of remembering. I left. I actually left. Somewhere around Ohio, she allowed herself to think about what she'd done. Not the logistics. Those were simple, and simplicity was the only advantage she had. She'd left the dress. She'd left the ring on the vanity. She hadn't written a note because a note would invite pursuit, and Damien was the kind of man who pursued. No. What she made herself think about was the cost, not the financial cost. That was Damien's problem now, and thinking about it gave her a guilty, uncharitable satisfaction she wasn't proud of. The real cost. Her mother would be humiliated. Her father would be bewildered, then furious. Her friends, the ones she had left, the ones Damien hadn't methodically edged out of her life, would hear the story secondhand, distorted, and would judge her without understanding. She would become a cautionary tale at Beacon Hill dinner parties. The Mercer girl who lost her mind. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it for months. And every time the calculation came out the same. The cost of staying was higher. Because staying meant marrying a man who had already shown her who he was. Not through dramatic violence. Damien was too smart for that, too aware of appearances. But through 1,000 small cuts. The way he interrupted her when she spoke. The way he told her what to wear, framed as compliments. "You look so much better in the blue." The way he managed her schedule, her friendships, her access to money. The way he could flip from charming to cold in the space of a sentence. And how she'd learned to read the weather in his eyes, the way sailors read the sky. Staying meant spending the rest of her life managing someone else's mood. And she knew She knew with the bone-deep certainty of experience that the management would get harder, that the margin of error would shrink, that eventually the grabs would become shoves and the shoves would become something worse, and by then she'd be so far inside the machine that the exit wouldn't be a door anymore. It would be a window. So she sat on the train and watched Ohio become Indiana, and Indiana become Illinois, and she let the guilt and the fear and the grief coexist inside her without trying to resolve any of it, because resolution was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. In Chicago, she had a 4-hour layover. She bought a coffee and sat in the station and watched people move around her, businessmen, families, college kids with backpacks, and felt the strange loneliness of being in a crowd when no one in the world knows exactly where you are. She wondered if Damien had found the ring yet. She wondered what his face looked like. She wondered if he was angry or hurt, and then she realized those were the same thing for him, anger and hurt, fused together into a single dark alloy she'd spent a year trying to separate. She boarded the connecting train at 2:15 p.m. The route ran northwest through Wisconsin and Minnesota, then cut west through the Dakotas and south into Wyoming. The landscape emptied. Cities became towns, became dots on a map, became nothing at all. Just grass and sky, and the occasional cluster of buildings that appeared and vanished like punctuation in a long, run-on sentence. She slept more on this leg. Deeper. The rocking of the train became something almost comforting, the rhythm of forward motion replacing the rhythm of dread she'd been living with. When she woke, it was dark, and the window showed only her own face and the occasional pinprick of a distant light, ranches and farmhouses scattered across black emptiness like stars fallen to earth. Cheyenne arrived at dawn. She stepped off the train into air so cold and thin it felt like breathing through glass. The station was small, functional, nothing like South Station's grand arches and marble. A few people milled around. A man in a cowboy hat, an actual cowboy hat, unironically, tipped his brim at her and kept walking. She stood on the platform with her suitcase and looked around. The sky was enormous. That was the first thing she noticed. In Boston, the sky was something you glimpsed between buildings. Here it was the main event, a dome of pale blue stretching to every horizon, so vast it made her dizzy. She had no plan. She had $3,047, minus the ticket, minus the sandwiches, minus the coffee. She had a suitcase with 4 days' worth of clothes and a pair of boots she'd impulse bought from a catalog 6 months ago and never worn. She had a degree in economics from a college that might as well have been on another planet. She had no friends, no contacts, no job, and no idea what happened next. She also had, for the first time in 14 months, no one telling her what to do. She picked up her suitcase and walked into the station. "Excuse me," she said to the woman behind the ticket counter. "Is there a bus or something that goes further west? Somewhere small?" The woman looked at her, took in the wool coat, the leather suitcase, the dark circles under her eyes. "How far west?" "I don't know. Small? A town? Somewhere with work, maybe." A pause. "There's a supply run goes out to Iron Ridge on Fridays. Truck driver named Pete. He sometimes takes passengers if you don't mind sitting on feed sacks." "Iron Ridge," Celeste repeated. "About 4 hours northwest, cattle country. Not much there, but there's a general store, a saloon, and people who don't ask too many questions." The woman paused. "You running from something, honey?" Celeste opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'm running towards something," she said. "I just don't know what it is yet." The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not a warm smile, but a knowing one. "Pete's out back. Tell him June sent you." "What?" The truck ride to Iron Ridge was 4 hours of unpaved road, frozen mud, and a driver named Pete who smelled like chewing tobacco and spoke approximately 19 words during the entire trip, 12 of which were, "Yep." Celeste sat on feed sacks in the back of the truck bed, wrapped in a horse blanket Pete had tossed her without explanation, and watched Wyoming unroll around her like a painting she'd never been told existed. Mountains in the distance, bruised purple and capped with snow. Grassland that rolled in frozen waves to every horizon. The sky, always the sky, so blue it hurt. She was cold. She was hungry. She was more frightened than she'd ever been in her life, including the times Damien had made her frightened, because at least then the fear had a shape and a name. This fear was formless, the fear of nothing. No structure, no safety net, no plan. But underneath the fear, buried so deep she almost missed it, was something else. A small, stubborn flicker. Not hope, exactly. Hope implied expectation, and she had none. It was more like space, room to breathe, the sensation of existing without someone else's hands on the controls. She held on to it. Iron Ridge appeared around 2 p.m., materializing out of the empty landscape like a mirage that had decided to commit. It was smaller than she'd imagined. One main street, unpaved, a general store, a saloon with a crooked sign, a blacksmith, a handful of wooden buildings clustered together as if for warmth. Beyond the town, scattered homesteads and ranch land stretched toward the mountains. Pete pulled up in front of the general store and jerked his thumb over his shoulder. This is it. Celeste climbed down from the truck bed. Her legs were stiff. Her fingers were numb. Her wool coat, which had been perfectly adequate for Boston winters, was laughably insufficient for Wyoming in January. Thanks, she said. Pete looked at her, chewed, spat. Store's open till 5. Elias will set you right. Then he drove away and Celeste stood alone on the main street of Iron Ridge, Wyoming, holding a leather suitcase and wearing Italian boots that were already ruined from the mud. And she thought, what have I done? The answer was something irreversible. And that was going to have to be enough. She pushed open the door of the general store. The interior was dim and warm and smelled like wood smoke and dried beans, and something sweet she couldn't identify. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with canned goods, tools, fabric, ammunition, saddles, medicine bottles. It was less a store and more an archive of everything required to survive in a place that actively tried to kill you. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, Chinese, with a weathered face, sharp eyes, and the kind of stillness that suggested he missed absolutely nothing. He was measuring flour into a paper sack and didn't look up when she entered. Closing in 3 hours, he said. If you're buying, buy. If you're browsing, there's a bench outside. I'm not buying, Celeste said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I'm looking for work. Now he looked up. His eyes traveled from her face to her coat, to her suitcase, to her ruined boots. The assessment took about 4 seconds and was, she suspected, extraordinarily thorough. Work, he repeated. Flat, not a question. Anything. I can count. I can organize. I'm good with numbers. Good with numbers. He set down the flour scoop. Where you from? She hesitated. East. That's not a place, that's a direction. Boston. Something shifted in his expression. Not softer. Elias Wu did not do soft, as she would learn, but slightly less dismissive. Boston. Long way to come for a job sacking flour. I didn't plan this very well, she admitted. No kidding. He studied her for another long moment. You eat today? I had a sandwich on the train. When? Yesterday, I think. He reached under the counter and produced a tin of crackers and a jar of preserves. Set them in front of her. Eat. Then we'll talk about whether you're useful or just lost. She ate. The crackers were stale and the preserves were too sweet, and it was the best meal she'd had in weeks, because no one was watching her eat it. No one was commenting on how much she took. No one was managing the experience. Elias watched her eat with the neutral patience of a man who had seen enough desperate people walk through his door to know the difference between someone who was running away and someone who was running toward. He wasn't sure which one she was yet. He wasn't sure she was either. I can offer you 2 things, he said when she finished. A cot in the storeroom and 12 hours a week at the counter. Pays nothing to brag about. But it's honest and it's warm, and I won't ask questions you don't want to answer. Celeste looked at him. At this stranger in this impossible place. Why would you do that? Because it's January, you're not dressed for it, and I'm short-handed since my last clerk got married and moved to Casper. He paused. And because anyone who comes this far from Boston to sack flour in Wyoming either has a real good reason or is completely crazy, and either way I can use the help. She almost laughed. It came out as something closer to a cough, rough and surprised, and she pressed her hand over her mouth. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. The cot's hard, the pay's bad, and the hours are worse. You'll earn every cent. That's fine, she said. I'm used to earning things the hard way. Elias gave her a look that said he doubted this very much, but he kept it to himself. He pointed to the back of the store. Storeroom's through there. There's a pump out back for water. Outhouse is 50 yards east, and if you hear coyotes at night, ignore them. They're more scared of you than you are of them. That seems unlikely, Celeste said. Give it a week, Elias said. You'll be the scariest thing in this town. She didn't believe him. She wouldn't believe him for a while, but she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the storeroom, and behind her she heard Elias return to his flour, the soft whisper of the scoop, the rustle of the paper sack, the ordinary sounds of a life she hadn't chosen, but was, minute by minute, choosing now. Dick, the cot was hard. Elias hadn't been lying about that. Celeste lay on it that first night, wrapped in 2 wool blankets that smelled like cedar and dust, and listened to Iron Ridge settle into darkness. The sounds were alien. Wind. Actual wind. Not the wind between buildings she knew from Boston, but open wind, the kind that crossed entire mountain ranges before reaching you, carrying cold and emptiness and a silence so deep it had texture. She couldn't sleep. Her mind wouldn't stop. By now they knew. Damien would have found the ring. Her mother would have been called. The Blackwood machinery would be in motion. Lawyers, private investigators, maybe police, though she hadn't committed any crime. And she suspected Damien would keep it quiet for as long as possible because a runaway bride was a scandal, and Damien Blackwood did not tolerate scandal. She wondered what story he was telling, that she'd had a breakdown, that she was ill, something that made him the victim and her the problem. He was good at that. He could rewrite any situation so that his hands were clean and someone else was the mess. She rolled onto her side and stared at the storeroom wall. Canned goods stacked floor to ceiling, bags of seed, coils of rope. The inventory of a world that operated on a logic entirely different from the one she'd been raised in. In Boston, value was measured in names, connections, net worth. Here, it was measured in whether you could make it through winter. She was not at all sure she could make it through winter, but she was here. That counted for something. She was here, and she was alive. And she was lying on a hard cot in a storeroom in Wyoming, and no one in this town knew her last name or her fiancé's net worth or which fork to use for the fish course. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was only what she did. Not what she came from, not what she was marrying into, just what she did. It was terrifying. It was the most honest thing she'd ever felt. She closed her eyes. The wind howled. Somewhere out in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered, and the sounds braided together into something wild and lonely and against all reason, almost beautiful. Celeste pulled the blanket tighter and waited for morning. Morning in Iron Ridge came hard and early. She woke to the sound of Elias banging on the storeroom door at 5:30 a.m. Daylight's burning, he said through the wood. Counter opens at 6. She stumbled upright, splashed water on her face from a basin so cold it made her gasp. Put on the same clothes she'd worn yesterday because her suitcase contained exactly 1 change, and she'd need to figure out laundry, which was apparently done by hand here, in a wash basin, which was a skill she did not possess. The store was already half alive when she emerged. Elias had the wood stove going and the front door propped open despite the cold, because, he explained, people need to know you're open. You close that door, they think you're dead. Cheerful, Celeste said. Practical, he corrected. Her first day behind the counter was an education in humility. She couldn't find anything. The organizational system, if it could be called that, existed entirely in Elias's head. Nails were next to canned peaches. Rifle cartridges shared a shelf with sewing needles. She asked him about it once, and he said, "Things go where they fit. But nails and peaches don't fit." "Sure they do. Both come in cans." She wasn't sure he was joking. With Elias, it was hard to tell. Customers came and went. Ranchers, mostly. Sun-beaten men and women in heavy coats who smelled like horses and spoke in short, practical sentences. They looked at Celeste with open curiosity and minimal warmth. She was new. She was clearly not from here. In a town of 80-odd people, that made her the most interesting thing to happen since the schoolteacher's barn collapsed in November. She tried to be useful. She swept. She stacked. She counted inventory with the careful precision that had earned her honors in economics at Wellesley, which was, she was discovering, a spectacularly useless credential in a place where the primary economic concerns were, will the cattle survive until spring, and do we have enough flour? By noon, her back ached. Her fingers were raw from handling rough-cut wood and metal tools, and she had developed a profound respect for anyone who had ever worked retail without a computerized register. Elias watched her from his usual post behind the counter. "You're slow," he observed. "I'm learning." "Same thing. Until it isn't. Speed up." She sped up, or tried to. She broke a jar of molasses at 2 p.m. and spent 20 minutes cleaning it up while Elias stood over her and said nothing, which was worse than if he'd yelled. "I'll pay for it," she said. "You bet you will. That's coming out of your first week." "My first week's pay won't cover a jar of molasses?" "It'll be close." She stared at him. He stared back, and then very slowly the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile. Elias Wu didn't smile, but something adjacent. "Don't break anything else," he said, and walked away. 3 days in, she met Rowan Mercer. She didn't know his name yet. He was just the tall man who came into the store on a Tuesday afternoon, stamped the mud off his boots, and dropped a list on the counter without greeting anyone. "Need this by Thursday," he said. His voice was rough. Not harsh. Rough. Like something that had been worn down by weather and use. He was maybe 35, hard to tell. Dark hair. A face that might have been handsome before exhaustion and grief had gotten to it. He stood the way men stand when they're used to carrying heavy things. Not just physical weight, but the other kind. The kind that doesn't come off when you set it down. Celeste picked up the list. Looked at it. Fence wire. Lumber. Salt blocks. Feed. Medical supplies. Veterinary, not human. The handwriting was blunt, each letter pressed hard into the paper. "I'll pull this together," she said. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time. His eyes were gray-green, the color of sage, and they did the same thing Elias's had done. A quick, comprehensive scan that took in everything and revealed nothing. "You're new," he said. "I am." "From where?" "East." A pause. Then, "That's what people say when they don't want to answer." "Maybe I don't want to answer." Another pause. Longer this time. He almost seemed amused, though the expression didn't reach his mouth. "Fair enough. Thursday." He tapped the counter once, turned, and walked out. She watched him go. Through the window, she saw him mount a horse. A real horse, saddled and patient, tied to a post outside, and ride out of town toward the north. Elias appeared beside her. "That's Rowan Mercer, owns the Broken Spur Ranch about 8 miles out. Used to be the best spread in the county." "Used to be?" "His wife died 3 years ago. Fever took her and their youngest. He's been running the place alone since. Barely." Elias began reshelf a row of cans. "Good man. Hard year. Bad luck on top of bad luck." Celeste looked at the list again. The amounts were small, too small for a ranch. She knew enough about numbers to see that Rowan Mercer was buying survival quantities, not operational ones. Just enough to get through the next week, then the next. "He can't afford this," she said quietly. Elias glanced at her. "No, he can't, but he'll pay what he can and I'll carry the rest, same as always." A pause. "Don't mention it to him. Man's got enough weight without knowing the whole town can see it." She nodded. She understood that. She understood it precisely. The first week passed, then the second. Celeste learned the store the way you learn a language. Awkwardly at first, then with increasing fluency. She learned which ranchers wanted to talk and which wanted to be left alone. She learned that Mrs. Clearwater, the widow who ran the boarding house, would trade gossip for an extra scoop of sugar. She learned that Tom Birch, who worked the smithy, was deaf in one ear and you had to stand on his left side. She learned that the Jennings family had 7 children and never enough money, and that Elias carried their account without complaint every single month. She learned that Iron Ridge was poor, not the polite hidden poverty of Boston's outer neighborhoods, but open, visible, structural poverty, the kind built into the land itself. Winters were brutal. Summers were dry. The nearest real town was Casper, 4 hours east. Everything cost too much and paid too little. and survival was less a guarantee than a negotiation conducted daily between human stubbornness and a landscape that had no particular interest in whether you made it. And yet, people stayed. They built. They repaired fences and delivered calves and stacked firewood and argued about water rights and helped each other when the snow got deep enough to kill. They did this not because it was easy or romantic or noble, but because it was theirs. This place, this frozen, difficult, unbeautiful place, it belonged to them. And that, Celeste was beginning to understand, was worth more than anything she'd left behind in Boston. She still thought about Damien, not constantly, but in flashes. The sound of his voice, the shape of his silhouette in a doorway, the way her stomach would clench when she heard heavy footsteps, even here, even now, even though the footsteps belonged to ranchers and merchants who had no idea they were triggering a reflex that had been beaten into her over 14 months. It would take time. She knew that. The bruises had faded. The reflexes would take longer. In the meantime, she worked. She counted. She organized Elias's shelves into something approaching a logical system, and he complained about it daily while quietly never changing it back. She balanced his books on the back of receipt paper and showed him he was losing $14 a month to a supply chain inefficiency he hadn't noticed. And he stared at the numbers for a long time and then said, "Huh. Huh good or huh bad?" she asked. "Huh. I've been doing this for 23 years, and a girl from Boston just found money I didn't know I was losing. Woman." "What?" "Woman from Boston." He looked at her. That almost smile again. "Don't push it." She pushed it. She couldn't help herself. She'd spent a year being small, and the act of being anything else, opinionated, capable, present, felt like learning to walk after a long illness. Shaky, uncertain, but directional, moving towards something. She just didn't know what yet. That answer was coming. It was 8 miles north on a failing ranch, waiting in the gray-green eyes of a man she'd spoken to for exactly 45 seconds. But she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that the cot was still hard, and the wind still howled, and she was still here, and she was not going back. The cold didn't get easier. That was the first lie Celeste caught herself believing, that eventually her body would adjust, that Wyoming winter would become something she could ignore the way she'd learned to ignore Boston rain. It didn't. 3 weeks in, the cold was just as vicious as the first morning, except now she understood it better, which almost made it worse. She knew how fast frostbite set in. She knew what happened to cattle caught in a whiteout. She knew that the wind chill could drop temperatures 40 degrees in an hour, and that an hour was enough to kill someone who wasn't paying attention. She was paying attention. She was paying attention to everything. Elias had given her a heavier coat, not new, pulled from a crate in the back of the store where he kept things people had traded in or left behind. It was canvas lined with sheepskin, 3 sizes too big, and it smelled like someone else's life. She wore it every day. She wore it the way she'd once worn cashmere, as armor. Different material, same function. By the end of January, she'd settled into a rhythm that felt less like a life and more like a negotiation with one. Wake at 5:30. Stoke the stove in the storeroom. Wash her face with water so cold it made her teeth ache. Open the store at 6. Work until noon. Eat whatever Elias had made, usually beans, sometimes stew, once a surprisingly good dumpling soup he refused to discuss. Work until 5. Close the store. Eat again. Sleep. Repeat. It was monotonous and exhausting, and she was grateful for every second of it, because monotony meant safety, and safety was a currency she'd been bankrupt of for over a year. The townspeople were warming to her, slowly. Iron Ridge wasn't a place that welcomed outsiders quickly. Too many people had passed through, taken what they needed, and moved on. Trust here was something you built with your hands, brick by brick, and Celeste was still on the foundation. But small things were changing. Mrs. Clearwater brought her a jar of preserved peaches and stayed to talk for 20 minutes about her late husband's fondness for fishing. Tom Birch nodded at her from across the street. Once, brief, but it was the first time he'd acknowledged her existence outside the store. The Jennings kids started waving when they saw her through the window, and Rowan Mercer kept coming in on Tuesdays. Always the same routine: stamp the mud off his boots, drop the list on the counter. Wait. He spoke more now, not much, but more. Short sentences, practical questions. He asked her once where she'd learned to keep books so clean, and she said college, and he said, huh, in exactly the same tone Elias used, and she wondered if it was a regional thing or if all men in Wyoming communicated primarily through monosyllables. She found herself watching for him, not romantically. She wasn't ready for that. Wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for that. Wasn't sure the wiring Damien had damaged could even carry that kind of current anymore. But there was something about Rowan that caught her attention the way a problem catches a mathematician's eye. He didn't fit. He moved through Iron Ridge like a man walking underwater, present but disconnected, doing what needed doing without any visible investment in the outcome. He reminded her of herself, actually, the version of herself she'd been in Boston during the last months, going through the motions, performing the role, alive on a technicality. It was the fourth Tuesday, early February, deep cold, sky the color of dirty ice, when the routine broke. He came in later than usual. The store was nearly empty. Elias was in the back doing inventory. Celeste was behind the counter, reconciling the week's accounts in a ledger she'd started keeping because Elias's system of remembering things was, in her professional opinion, catastrophic. Rowan put the list down. She picked it up, looked at it, and stopped. The list was shorter than usual. Much shorter. Feed, salt. 1 box of .45 cartridges. That was it. No fence wire, no lumber, no veterinary supplies. The handwriting was the same, heavy, pressed hard, but the letters were shakier, like the hand holding the pencil had been trembling. She looked up at him. Really looked. His face was drawn. Not just tired, hollowed out. The skin under his eyes was dark, almost bruised. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles working. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, or who had slept but found no rest in it. Just the 3 items, he said. His voice was flat, emptied. She could have nodded and pulled the order. That would have been the professional thing, the safe thing. But Celeste had spent a year being safe, staying quiet, not asking, not pushing, managing someone else's mood instead of trusting her own instincts, and she was tired of it. What happened to the fence wire? She asked. He looked at her, not angry, surprised. People in Iron Ridge didn't ask Rowan Mercer personal questions. It was an unspoken rule. The man had lost his wife and child. He was allowed his silence. Don't need it, he said. Last 3 weeks you did. This week I don't. She held his gaze. She could feel herself crossing a line, the same way she could feel it when she argued with Damien. Except this was different. Damien's lines were traps. This was just the edge of something honest. Elias told me about your ranch, she said, about how it's been since things changed. Rowan's jaw tightened. Elias talks too much. Elias barely talks at all. That's how I know it's serious. Something flickered in his eyes. She couldn't read it. Pain, maybe. Or the exhausted anger of a man who's been strong for too long and is starting to crack. Sold the East Pasture, he said, quietly, like he was confessing something. Last week, 40 acres. Got half what it's worth because the buyer knew I needed the money, and I couldn't wait. Celeste set down the pencil. 40 acres. Had to. The banknote's due in March, and I'm short by more than I can make up running cattle through winter. He said this without self-pity. Just facts. The way you'd describe weather. Fence wire doesn't matter if there's no fence to put it on. Who bought it? A man named Crow. Victor Crow. He has a spread south of here, biggest in the county. Rowan paused. He's been buying up land all winter. Every rancher who comes up short, he's there with an offer. Always fair enough that you can't refuse, and always low enough that he profits. Celeste filed the name. Victor Crow. She'd heard it mentioned in the store, once by Mrs. Clearwater, once by a rancher named Harlan, who'd spit after saying it, as if the name left a bad taste. How much do you owe the bank? She asked. Rowan stared at her. That's not a question you ask someone. I know. How much? A long silence. The stove crackled. Wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the back, Elias dropped something and swore in Cantonese. $1,200, Rowan said. Due March 15th. $1,200. She did the math automatically. She couldn't help it. Numbers were the one skill set that translated perfectly from Wellesley to Wyoming. She thought about the cattle prices she'd overheard ranchers discussing. She thought about the feed costs. She thought about what 40 acres of sold land meant for a ranch that was already too small to sustain itself. You can't make that running cattle through winter, she said. I'm aware. What happens if you miss the payment? Crow's been holding secondary notes on half the ranches in the county. He doesn't own the bank, but he might as well. If I miss the payment, the bank calls the note, Crow buys the land at auction, and I lose everything my family built over 30 years. He said it evenly. Like he'd rehearsed it. Like he'd said it to himself enough times that the words had worn smooth. The water rights alone are worth 10 times what the bank's owed. Crow knows that. That's why he's circling. Water rights? Broken Spur sits on the only natural spring for 20 miles. Every ranch in the area depends on creek runoff from my land. If Crow controls the spring, he controls every rancher in the valley. He can set prices, dictate terms, buy up anyone who can't pay. Rowan's voice hardened. He's not building a ranch. He's building a monopoly. Celeste stared at him. The economics were suddenly, brutally clear. This wasn't just one man's financial trouble. This was a chess game, and Victor Crow was playing it 3 moves ahead while everyone else reacted 1 move at a time. Has anyone organized against him? She asked. The other ranchers, the merchants, if you pooled resources. You've been here a month, Rowan said. Not unkindly, but with the bluntness of someone who'd already run through every option and come up empty. People here can barely keep their own places running. Nobody's got resources to pool. That's the whole point. Crow doesn't need to be stronger than all of us. He just needs to be stronger than each of us, one at a time. He picked up his list. Forget the cartridges, just the feed and salt. Rowan, I'll settle up on Thursday. He turned toward the door. Stopped. Looked back at her. I don't know what you left behind in Boston. I figure it was bad enough to bring you here, which means it was real bad. But this place, Iron Ridge, it eats people. Don't let it eat you trying to fix things that can't be fixed. He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. Cold air rushed in and died against the stove's heat. Celeste stood behind the counter for a long time after he left, holding a list with 2 items on it, thinking about water rights and monopolies and a man who'd lost everything except the willingness to keep losing. Elias appeared from the back, looked at her face, looked at the list, said nothing for a moment. You're going to try to help him, he said. Not a question. I don't know. Yes, you do. I can see it. That look. I've seen it on people before. He leaned against the counter. People who get that look either save the day or get themselves killed. In my experience, the split's about 50-50. Encouraging. I'm not in the encouragement business. I sell flour and nails. He paused. But if you're going to stick your neck out, you should know what you're sticking it into. Crow's not just rich. He's connected. Territorial judge in Casper owes him favors. Sheriff here, Ed Granger, looks the other way on things he shouldn't. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly the way Crow wants it to. Then someone has to break it. Sure, and that someone usually ends up face down in a ditch. He held up a hand before she could respond. I'm not saying don't. I'm saying know the cost before you buy. She nodded. She understood cost. She'd paid enough of it in her life to recognize the currency. That night, lying on the hard cot, listening to the wind, she didn't think about Damien for the first time since she'd left Boston. She thought about Rowan Mercer, about Victor Crow, about $1,200 and a water spring and a town full of people being squeezed slowly enough that they'd accepted the pressure as normal. She knew what that felt like. She knew exactly what that felt like. The next morning, she asked Elias if she could borrow a horse. He laughed, actually laughed, which was so rare she almost didn't recognize the sound. You know how to ride? No. Then why would I lend you a horse? Because I need to see the Broken Spur Ranch. I need to see the books, the land, the operation. I need to understand the numbers before I can figure out whether there's a way through this. Elias stopped laughing. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first day. That thorough, nothing-missed assessment. You're serious. I had a life where I wasn't allowed to be serious about anything. I'm making up for lost time. He chewed on that. Then he went to the back and came out with a pair of heavy gloves and a wool hat. Take the mule. Her name's Patience. She's slow, she's mean, and she'll bite you if you give her the chance. Sound like anyone you know? Is that a compliment? It's a warning for the mule. She took Patience, who was indeed slow and mean, and attempted to bite her twice before they'd cleared the town. and rode 8 miles north through frozen grassland under a sky so low and gray it felt like a ceiling. The ride took 2 hours because the mule refused to hurry and Celeste refused to fall off, and the compromise between these two positions was a pace that would have embarrassed a turtle. The broken spur appeared gradually, the way everything appeared in Wyoming, a slow materialization out of empty space. Fence lines first, many of them broken or leaning, then outbuildings, a barn with a patched roof, a bunkhouse with no smoke coming from the chimney, then the main house, a low wooden structure that had once been solid and was now showing the kind of wear that comes from a building being maintained by one pair of hands that didn't have time to maintain it. Rowan was in the corral breaking ice on a water trough with an axe. He saw her coming and stopped mid-swing. Stood there with the axe in one hand, watching her approach with an expression that started at confused and traveled quickly through suspicious before settling somewhere around grudgingly curious. "What are you doing here?" he asked when she'd gotten close enough to speak without shouting. Celeste dismounted, or rather she slid off the mule in a controlled fall that she chose to categorize as dismounting. "I want to see your books." "My books?" "Financial records, ledgers, whatever you have. I want to see what you owe, what you earn, what you spend. I want to see where the money goes and where it doesn't come from." "And then what?" "And then I'll tell you whether there's a way to save this ranch or whether you should start packing." He stared at her. The axe hung loose at his side. A horse in the corral snorted and stamped, impatient with the cold. The wind cut across the open space between them, carrying ice crystals that stung her cheeks. "Why?" he said. It was the same question she'd asked Elias when he'd offered her the cot. "Why would you help?" And she found herself giving an answer she hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't even fully understood until the words left her mouth. Because where I come from, I watched a man use money and power to trap people, to control them, to make them small, and I ran away from it instead of fighting it because I was scared and alone, and I didn't think I could win. She paused. The wind was making her eyes water. That was what she told herself. "I'm still scared. I'm still probably not going to win, but I'm not alone anymore, and I'm done running from men who think they can own people." Rowan looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that wasn't about seeing what was on the surface, but about measuring what was underneath. She'd seen that look on Elias. She was starting to think it was a frontier thing, a skill people developed when survival depended on reading strangers accurately because there was no time for second chances. "Books are in the house," he said. "They're a mess." "I'd be surprised if they weren't." He almost smiled. Not quite. But the muscles around his eyes shifted in a way that suggested the machinery was still in there, rusty but functional. "Coffee's on the stove. It's terrible." "Everything here is terrible. I'm getting used to it." He turned and walked toward the house. She followed. Patience, the mule, immediately began eating a fence post. The house was exactly what she'd expected, and nothing she was prepared for. Small. 3 rooms, a kitchen that doubled as a living space, a bedroom with the door closed, and a smaller room that had been, she could tell from the faded paint on the walls, pale blue with small stars, a child's room. That door was closed too. And something about the way Rowan walked past it, not looking, told her it had been closed for a long time. The kitchen table was covered in paper, not neatly stacked, scattered. Receipts, bank letters, tax notices, feed invoices, a few handwritten notes in a woman's handwriting that Celeste carefully didn't mention. She sat down and began sorting. It took her 4 hours. Rowan sat across from her for the first hour, answering questions in his terse, economical way. "How many head of cattle?" 63, down from 110 2 years ago. "How many ranch hands?" 2. Used to be 6, but he couldn't afford them. "What was the annual cost of feed?" Too much. "What was the revenue from last year's cattle sale?" Not enough. After the first hour, he left to work. She could hear him outside, the rhythmic thud of the axe on ice, the creak of fence wire being tightened, the low murmur of his voice talking to horses. He talked to animals more easily than he talked to people. She'd noticed that. She worked through the numbers the way she'd been trained to work through numbers, the way Professor Harrington at Wellesley had taught her, not looking for answers, but looking for patterns. And the patterns were bad. The ranch was bleeding money. Not dramatically, Rowan was too frugal for that, but steadily, inevitably, the way a slow leak drains a tank. Feed costs had risen 30% over 2 years, driven by supply shortages and what she suspected were inflated prices from a distributor who was, she made a note to check, possibly connected to Victor Crow. Cattle prices had dropped. 2 harsh winters had killed livestock and damaged infrastructure. The banknote, originally manageable, had become a noose as income dried up and expenses swelled. But underneath the bleak numbers, she found something. Not a solution, she wasn't naive enough to call it that yet, but a thread. The spring. Rowan's water rights. She'd understood abstractly what he'd told her in the store, but now, looking at the actual survey documents and deed records, she saw the full picture. The Broken Spurs spring fed 3 major creeks that watered half the valley. The water rights, under territorial law, belonged to the landowner. Rowan had never charged for water access because his family never had. It was a neighborly tradition, part of the social fabric of Iron Ridge. But legally, he could. And if he could, then the water rights had value far beyond what any banknote represented. They were, in fact, the single most valuable asset in the county, which was exactly why Crow wanted them. She sat back in the chair. The light through the kitchen window was fading. She'd been at the table for 4 hours, and her back ached, and her eyes were dry, and she had 16 pages of notes written in handwriting that got progressively messier as the afternoon wore on. Rowan came in from outside, stomping snow off his boots. He smelled like horse sweat and cold air and wood smoke. He looked at the papers spread across the table, then at her face. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad? I know bad. I've been living bad. Give me something I don't know." She took a breath. "Your water rights are worth more than every other asset you have combined. Crow knows this. The banknote, the falling cattle prices, the rising feed costs. Some of this is bad luck, but some of it isn't. Your feed distributor in Casper, who is he? Frank Aldridge. And Frank Aldridge, does he have any connection to Crow?" Rowan's face changed, not dramatically, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that spread from his jaw down through his shoulders. "Frank's wife is Crow's cousin. So the man selling you feed at inflated prices is family with the man trying to buy your land at deflated prices." She let that sit. "That's not bad luck, Rowan. That's a strategy." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Didn't speak for a while. She watched him process it, not the information itself, because she suspected he'd already sensed some of this, the way you sense a predator before you see it, but the confirmation. The certainty that his instincts had been right. That he wasn't just failing, he was being failed, deliberately. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years I've been thinking I just wasn't good enough. Wasn't smart enough. Couldn't hold it together after Marnie died. He stopped. His hands were flat on the table, pressing down hard, as if he needed to anchor himself to something. And the whole time he was squeezing me. "Not just you. Every rancher in the valley. You're just the biggest target because of the water. What do I do?" The question was raw, unguarded in a way she hadn't heard from him before. He wasn't asking the question of a financial analyst or a store clerk from Boston. He was asking the question of another human being who might understand what it felt like to realize that the walls closing in around you weren't accidents. They were architecture. "I don't know yet," she said, because she wasn't going to lie to him. "But I know the numbers now. And numbers don't care who's powerful, they just tell the truth." He looked at her across the table, scattered with the financial wreckage of his life. The kitchen was cold. The coffee was terrible. Outside, the wind was picking up again, pushing snow sideways past the window. "You came out here on a mule," he said. "I did. An 8-mile ride, in February, on a mule. Her name is Patience. I know Patience. She bit me once. She tried to bite me twice. That means she likes you." They looked at each other. And something happened that Celeste hadn't experienced in so long she almost didn't recognize it. A moment of connection that wasn't transactional, wasn't strategic, wasn't about what one person could do for another. Just 2 damaged people sitting in a cold kitchen, surrounded by debt and paper, and seeing each other clearly. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then Rowan looked away, cleared his throat, and said, "You should head back before dark. Trail's hard to see after sunset." "I'll come back tomorrow. I need to look at the deed records more carefully." You don't have to do this. I know. I can't pay you. I know that too. He shook his head, not in refusal, in something closer to bewilderment. I don't understand you. That's okay. I don't really understand me either right now. She stood and began gathering her notes. But I understand numbers, and right now, that's enough. She rode Patience back to Iron Ridge in the last light of the day, the sky turning from gray to purple to black, the stars appearing one by one like someone was poking holes in a dark cloth. She was cold and sore and hungry, and she felt more alive than she had in 2 years. That scared her. Feeling alive was dangerous. It meant caring about outcomes. It meant having something to lose. She'd come to Wyoming to escape, to survive, to exist without the crushing weight of someone else's expectations. She hadn't planned on mattering to anyone. She hadn't planned on finding a fight worth fighting, but the numbers were in her head now. Rowan's debt, Crow's strategy, the water rights, the interconnected web of financial pressure that was slowly strangling an entire community. She couldn't unsee it. She'd tried to unsee things before, in Boston, and the cost of that blindness had been bruises and fear and a version of herself she never wanted to meet again. So she rode back through the darkness on a mean mule, with 16 pages of notes in her coat pocket and no clear plan, and she made a decision that wasn't dramatic or cinematic or even particularly brave. She just decided to keep going, to keep looking at the numbers, to keep asking questions, to keep being useful in a place that hadn't asked for her help but might, she was beginning to think, need it. Elias was waiting at the store when she returned. He had stew on the stove and a look on his face that said he'd been worried but would die before admitting it. You're late, he said. The mule is slow. The mule is slow because you don't know how to ride. There's a difference. She sat down at the counter and ate stew that was too salty and completely wonderful. Elias, the feed distributor in Casper, Frank Aldridge. He's connected to Crow, isn't he? Elias set down his spoon. You found that. You knew? I suspected. Knowing and suspecting are different things out here. Suspecting keeps you careful. Knowing makes you a target. How many other businesses does Crow have connections to? Supply lines, services, anything that flows through Iron Ridge? Elias was quiet for a long time. He seemed to be weighing something. Not whether to tell her, but how much. Finally, he said, the feed distributor, the lumber mill in Rollins, the cattle buyer who comes through in spring, and Ed Granger. The sheriff? Crow doesn't own him outright, but he doesn't have to. Ed's got a mortgage he can't cover on a sheriff's salary. Crow holds a personal loan on it. Nothing illegal, just leverage. Elias picked up his spoon again. Welcome to Iron Ridge, where everything's connected and nothing's an accident. Celeste thought about this. About a web of financial relationships designed not to create wealth but to create dependence. About a man, Crow, who understood that the most effective way to control people wasn't through force but through debt, through the slow and visible tightening of economic pressure until every option pointed toward him. She recognized the pattern. Different scale, different setting, but the same fundamental architecture. Damien had done it to her with isolation and emotional control. Crow was doing it to an entire community with money and leverage. I need to meet the other ranchers, she said. The ones Crow's been pressuring. I need to see their books too. Why? Because one ranch's books tell one story. 10 ranches' books might tell a bigger one. If Crow's been systematically inflating prices and suppressing land values, there'll be a pattern. Patterns or evidence. Elias studied her. You really did go to college, didn't you? Top of my class in econometrics. I don't know what that word means. It means I'm good at finding patterns in numbers that people are trying to hide, he grunted, which, from Elias, was practically an ovation. I'll introduce you to some people, but listen to me. He set down his spoon and looked directly at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not warmth, exactly, but something protective. Something that said he'd been through enough to know what happened to people who stood between powerful men and what they wanted. Crow doesn't fight fair. He doesn't fight at all if he can help it. He just arranges things so you destroy yourself. By the time you realize what happened, he's standing there with an offer and a handshake, and everyone thinks he's doing you a favor. Sounds like someone I used to know, Celeste said quietly. Elias nodded. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Over the next 2 weeks, Celeste met the ranchers of Iron Ridge. Elias took her, on patience, because Elias refused to lend her anything with actual speed until she could ride properly. And her riding lessons consisted of Elias standing in the corral shouting "Stop bouncing" while she bounced. They visited the Clearwater spread, where Mrs. Clearwater's son Daniel was running 60 head on land that needed 100 to break even. They visited the Jennings place, where 7 kids and 2 parents worked a homestead that was slowly being eaten by debt. They visited old Harlan Beck, who ran a small herd on land his grandfather had claimed, and who described Victor Crow using language Celeste had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. Each time she asked the same questions. How much do you owe? Who do you buy from? Who do you sell to? What are your costs? Each time the story was different in the details and identical in the structure. Rising costs, falling prices, debts that grew faster than income, and underneath it all, like tree roots breaking through pavement, Victor Crow, his distributors, his buyers, his loans, his offers. She compiled the data in a ledger she bought from Elias at cost. He'd tried to give it to her for free, and she'd insisted on paying because she was learning that in Iron Ridge, taking charity was a transaction with interest. She filled page after page with numbers, cross-referencing suppliers, comparing prices, mapping connections. And slowly, the pattern emerged. It was elegant, in a horrible way. Crow wasn't doing anything illegal, or at least nothing provably illegal. He was using legitimate business relationships to create artificial pressure. His cousin's husband charged 15% above market for feed. His associate at the lumber mill charged 20% above market for fencing materials. His preferred cattle buyer offered 10% below market at auction. Each individual markup was defensible. Market conditions, they'd say. Supply and demand. But taken together, applied systematically across an entire county, the cumulative effect was devastating. Ranchers who should have been solvent were drowning. And when they drowned, Crow was there with a life preserver that happened to come attached to a deed of sale. It was Tuesday again, the 5th Tuesday since she'd arrived, when she brought her findings back to Rowan. He was repairing a section of fence near the barn, working in the thin February light with hands that were cracked and raw from cold. She noticed he'd lost weight since she'd first met him. Not much, but enough that the angles of his face were sharper, the hollows deeper. She spread the ledger on a fence post and walked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Rowan interrupted when he was uncomfortable, she'd noticed. When he went quiet, it meant he was actually hearing you. So the inflation isn't natural, he said when she finished. Some of it is. Winter always drives up feed costs. But the premium above market is consistent, and it only applies to ranchers in this county. I checked with a supplier in Laramie. Their prices are 20% lower than what Aldridge charges. Then why don't we buy from Laramie? Because Crow controls the freight route. The only wagon road from Laramie comes through Crow's land. He charges a crossing fee that wipes out the savings. I checked that too. Rowan set down his pliers. He looked out across the ranch, the broken fences, the thin cattle, the barn with its patched roof, and his face did something she hadn't seen before. It collapsed, just for a second. The mask of stoic endurance slipped, and underneath was raw, helpless fury. He thought of everything, Rowan said. Almost everything. He looked at her. What did he miss? The water rights. He needs them, and he can't take them by force. He can only get them if you sell voluntarily or the bank forecloses and he buys at auction, which means he needs you to fail, which means he needs you to believe you're failing on your own, not because he's engineering it. But now I know. Now you know. And knowledge changes the math. How? Celeste took a breath. This was the part she'd been turning over in her head for days. The part that was either the beginning of a solution or the beginning of something much worse. The other ranchers, they're all in the same position. Individually, none of you can fight Crow. But collectively, you have leverage. If every rancher in the valley stops buying from Aldridge simultaneously and organizes a supply run from Laramie, overland, around Crow's land, through the mountain pass, you break his supply chain monopoly. The mountain pass is dangerous in winter. I know. People have died on that route. I know that too. And you think a bunch of broke ranchers are going to risk their lives hauling feed through a mountain pass in February because a bookkeeper from Boston showed them some numbers? The words should have stung. Maybe they were meant to. But Celeste heard something underneath them. Not dismissal, but fear. The fear of hope. The fear of believing something could work and watching it fail. Rowan had already lost so much. He couldn't afford to lose hope, too. I think, she said carefully, that people who are already losing everything have very little left to risk. And I think being angry at the right person is better than being ashamed for no reason. He stared at her. The wind blew. A horse in the corral whinnied. Somewhere across the valley, smoke rose from a chimney in a thin gray line. You're going to get yourself killed, he said. Maybe. But I'll die knowing why, and that's more than I had in Boston. He didn't respond to that. He picked up his pliers and went back to the fence. But she saw his hands. They were steadier than they'd been 5 minutes ago. She rode back to Iron Ridge as the sun set, turning the snow to copper and then to shadow. Her mind was full of numbers and logistics and the particular stomach-churning awareness that she had just volunteered to make an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. She passed the saloon on her way to the store and glanced through the window. Inside, she saw a man she didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed for Iron Ridge, with silver hair and a posture that radiated the specific kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. He was sitting at a corner table with Sheriff Ed Granger, and they were laughing about something. She didn't need to be told who he was. She knew the way you know a storm is coming before the first thunder. The way you know a predator by the way the room arranges itself around it. Victor Crow. He looked up as she passed the window. Their eyes met through the glass. He didn't know who she was. She was sure of that. She was just a woman on a mule, nobody important, no threat at all. But something in his gaze made her stomach clench. Not cruelty. She'd seen cruelty in Damien's eyes, and this was different. This was appraisal. The quick automatic calculation of a man who evaluated everything and everyone in terms of usefulness and threat. She looked away first, rode on, dismounted at the store, went inside, closed the door. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold. You look like you saw a ghost, Elias said from behind the counter. I saw Victor Crow. Elias was quiet for a moment. And he looked at me like I was a fence post, something in the way that might need to be removed eventually, but not worth thinking about today. Good. The day he starts thinking about you is the day your problems get a lot worse. Celeste hung up her coat, sat down on the stool behind the counter, pressed her hands flat against her knees, the way she used to in Boston when the anxiety got bad. When the trembling started and she needed something solid to push against, she thought about Damien, not the fear of him, but the lesson. The lesson that power, when it operates in the dark, is almost impossible to fight. But when you drag it into the light, when you name it, document it, show people the machinery behind the curtain, it becomes something else. Not weaker, necessarily, but visible. And visible things can be challenged in ways invisible ones can't. She pulled the ledger from her coat and set it on the counter, opened it to the first page of numbers, began writing. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Another storm was coming. She could feel it in the pressure behind her eyes, in the way the air tasted of iron and ice. Let it come, she thought. She'd survived worse storms than weather. The storm she'd felt coming arrived 2 days later, and it wasn't the kind made of snow. Celeste was behind the counter at 6 a.m, reorganizing the ammunition shelf. Elias insisted rifle cartridges belonged next to canned peaches, and she'd finally given up arguing. When the door opened and a man she'd never seen walked in. He was young, maybe 25, clean-shaven, wearing a coat too expensive for Iron Ridge and boots too polished for February mud. He carried himself with the careful posture of someone delivering a message they'd rehearsed. "Miss Mercer?" he said. The name hit her like a slap. She hadn't used it here. She'd been Celeste at the store. Just Celeste, no last name, and the fact that this stranger knew it meant someone had been asking questions. "Who's asking?" she said. "My name is Calvin Rhodes. I work for Mr. Victor Crow." He said it the way people say they work for the president, with reflected importance and a hint of warning. "Mr. Crow would like to invite you to dinner this Friday evening at his residence. He understands you've been doing some bookkeeping work for local ranchers, and he'd like to discuss a business opportunity." Celeste's hands went still on the shelf. Behind her, she could hear Elias in the back room. He'd stopped moving, listening. A business opportunity, she repeated. Mr. Crow is always interested in people with financial talent, especially newcomers who show initiative. Calvin smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind you develop working for someone who requires smiles to be strategic. He's a generous employer. I think you'd find the conversation worthwhile. She knew what this was. She'd lived inside this machinery before. The charming invitation, the flattering language, the implication that saying yes was smart and saying no was foolish. Damien had operated the same way. Every interaction framed as an offer you couldn't refuse because refusing meant you didn't understand your own best interest. Tell Mr. Crow I appreciate the invitation, she said, but I'm busy Friday. Calvin's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation. Perhaps another evening then? Mr. Crow is flexible. I'm busy every evening. The smile finally cracked, just slightly, a hairline fracture in the performance. Miss Mercer, I'd encourage you to reconsider. Mr. Crow doesn't extend invitations lightly. Declining could be misinterpreted. As what? As unfriendly. Celeste set down the box of cartridges. She looked at Calvin Rhodes, at his expensive coat and his rehearsed delivery and the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cold, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, anger. The specific, focused anger of a woman who had spent a year being managed by a man who framed threats as courtesies. Tell Mr. Crow, she said, that I don't accept dinner invitations from men I haven't met. If he'd like to discuss business, he can come to the store during operating hours, same as everyone else. Calvin stared at her for a moment. Then he nodded, a short, clipped motion, turned, and walked out. The door closed behind him. Cold air lingered. Elias appeared from the back. He was holding a bag of flour he had apparently forgotten he was carrying. His face was unreadable, which meant he was worried. Well, he said, that's that. What do you mean? I mean, you just told Victor Crow no. People don't tell Victor Crow no. Not in this county. He set down the flour. He sent a man to your door, which means he knows who you are. He knows what you've been doing. And he offered you a seat at his table, which is how he operates. Buy them first, break them second. Elias paused. You just skipped him straight to second. I wasn't going to sit at his table and let him size me up like livestock. I know, and I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying there are consequences for being right in a place like this. Celeste looked at the door Calvin had walked through. Her pulse was elevated, her hands wanted to shake, and she wouldn't let them. What kind of consequences? Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the main street, where Calvin was mounting a horse, a beautiful horse, because even Crow's employees rode expensive animals. He watched him ride south, toward Crow's territory, and then he turned back to Celeste. Ask Harlan Beck about his barn, he said, the one that burned down last October. The words settled over the store like snow. Celeste didn't ask follow-up questions. She didn't need to. She went to see Rowan that afternoon, not on patience this time. She'd graduated, under Elias's grudging instruction, to a horse named Jack, who was faster and only slightly less temperamental. The ride took an hour instead of 2, which meant she arrived at the broken spur with feelings still in her fingers. Rowan was in the barn, shoveling hay. He looked up when she came in and immediately read something on her face because he set down the shovel and said, What happened? She told him about Calvin Rhodes, about the invitation, about Elias's comment regarding Harlan Beck's barn. Rowan listened the way he always listened, still, focused, absorbing information the way dry ground absorbs rain. Harlan's barn didn't just burn, he said when she finished. It burned on the same night he told Crow he wouldn't sell his grazing rights. Everyone knew. Nobody could prove anything. There was no investigation because Ed Granger called it an accident, and that was that. And nobody pushed back? Push back how? Against who? Crow didn't set the fire. Someone who works for Crow might have set the fire. But Crow was in Casper that night, at a dinner with the territorial judge with 40 witnesses. That's how he operates. His hands are always clean. Celeste leaned against the barn wall. The wood was rough against her back. The smell of hay and horse was becoming familiar. Not pleasant, exactly, but known. I've been talking to the other ranchers about the supply chain, the price manipulation. Daniel Clearwater is willing to organize a supply run through the mountain pass. The Jennings are in. Harlan's in. He's been waiting for someone to give him a reason to fight. A supply run won't save anyone if Crow retaliates. Crow retaliates against individuals. That's the whole strategy. Pick off one rancher at a time so no one else sees the pattern. But if everyone moves together, he can't pick anyone off without exposing himself. Rowan shook his head, not disagreement, frustration. You're talking about organizing 20 families who've spent 3 years being afraid. Fear doesn't go away because someone shows up with a ledger and a plan. No, it goes away when people get angrier than they are afraid. He looked at her, that measuring look she'd come to know. You sound like you've done this before. I haven't, but I've been on the other side of it. I know what it feels like to be controlled by someone who's smarter than you about leverage. And I know that the only thing that breaks the cycle is deciding the cost of fighting is lower than the cost of surrender. She paused. For me, that decision happened in a bathroom in Boston at 2 a.m. For Iron Ridge, it needs to happen now. And if it doesn't work? Then we're no worse off than we already are. Crow takes the ranches, controls the water, owns the valley. That's where this is heading anyway. At least this way we go down swinging. Rowan was quiet for a long time. He picked up the shovel, set it down again, walked to the barn door and looked out across his land. The snow-covered pastures, the thin cattle, the mountains beyond. His ranch, his family's ranch, the place where his wife had lived and his child had been born and both had died. Friday, he said. We'll meet Friday. At the store after closing. I'll talk to Daniel and Harlan. You talk to the Jennings and Mrs. Clearwater. He turned to face her. But I'm telling them the truth. All of it. The numbers, the risk, and the fact that Victor Crow will come for us the minute he finds out. I wouldn't want it any other way. He almost smiled, still not quite reaching it, but closer than before. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met. And I grew up with cattle. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't one, but something in his voice said otherwise. She chose not to push it. She'd learned that about Rowan. You couldn't rush him toward anything. Not trust, not vulnerability, not whatever was slowly building between them in the spaces between practical conversations about feed prices and debt ratios. It was there. She felt it. But it was fragile the way winter ice is fragile. Strong enough to stand on, if you were careful, thin enough to crack if you weren't. She left the broken spur as the light faded and rode back to town with a knot in her stomach that was equal parts determination and dread. She'd started something. A rock was rolling downhill, and she couldn't stop it now, even if she wanted to. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Friday came fast. 13 people crowded into the back of Elias's store after closing. 13, out of a town of 80, out of a valley of maybe 200. It was a small number. It felt enormous. They sat on crates and flour sacks and leaned against shelves. Ranchers, mostly. Daniel Clearwater, 28, with his mother's sharp eyes and his dead father's land. Harlan Beck, 60-something, leather-faced, still furious about his barn. The Jennings, both parents, because who would watch the kids, Celeste had asked, and Martha Jennings had said, the kids can watch themselves for one night. This matters. Tom Birch, from the smithy. 2 ranch hands from a spread west of town she hadn't visited yet. Mrs. Clearwater, who had brought a pie because Mrs. Clearwater brought pie everywhere, including apparently the planning sessions for economic rebellion. And Rowan, standing in the back corner, arms crossed, watching. Celeste stood in front of them and felt, for a single terrified moment, completely inadequate. Who was she? A runaway from Boston who'd been in Wyoming for 6 weeks. A woman who'd never run a ranch, never branded a calf, never survived a winter that could kill her. She had numbers and theories and a degree from a college none of these people had heard of, and she was about to ask them to risk what little they had left on the word of a stranger. She opened the ledger. I'm not going to pretend I know this land the way you do, she said. I don't. I've been here 6 weeks and I still can't ride a horse properly. A small laugh from someone. Tom, she thought. But I know numbers, and the numbers tell a story that I think you already know but haven't been able to prove. She walked them through it, slowly, without jargon. Feed prices inflated through Aldridge's connection to Crow. Cattle prices depressed through Crow's influence on the spring buyers. Lumber and supplies marked up through associated businesses. And underneath all of it, the water rights. The real prize, The strategic objective, everything else was designed to deliver. The room was quiet when she finished. Not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of people confronting something they'd felt in their bones but never seen laid out in black ink on white paper. Harlan spoke first. I told you, I told every one of you that son of a bitch was rigging it. Knowing and doing are two different things, Harlan, Daniel Clearwater said. What are we supposed to do? Sue him? With what money? In front of what judge? The judge in Casper plays cards at Crow's house every other Saturday. We don't need a judge, Celeste said. We need a supply chain that doesn't run through Crow's people. If we can get feed and materials from Laramie through the mountain pass, we cut his price advantage. That alone saves every ranch in this room between $200 and $400 a year. The mountain pass in winter is suicide, said one of the ranch hands she didn't know. It's dangerous, Rowan said from the back corner. His voice cut through the noise the way it always did. Not loud, but heavy, carrying weight. I won't lie about that, but I've run cattle through that pass in March. It's doable. Tight window, but doable. And what happens when Crow finds out? Martha Jennings asked. She was holding her husband's hand. We cut his supply chain. He doesn't just shrug and walk away. He burns barns. He calls in loans. He makes things happen to people who cross him. He does those things to individuals, Celeste said. One rancher at a time, one barn at a time. Because individuals are easy to isolate and easy to blame. But if the whole valley moves together, if everyone switches suppliers on the same day, if everyone has the same numbers showing the same pattern of price manipulation, he can't pick us off one by one. He'd have to take on the entire community, and that's a fight he can't win quietly. How do you know? Daniel asked. Because his whole strategy depends on secrecy. The minute it becomes public, the minute everyone sees the connections, the markup pattern, the web of influence, his leverage disappears. He's not powerful because he's strong. He's powerful because nobody talks to each other about what he's doing to them separately. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Iron Ridge people didn't do dramatic, but she could feel it. A settling. Like foundation stones finding their place. These people had been carrying the weight of Crow's operation for years, each one believing they were failing alone, and now they were sitting in a room together realizing the failure was engineered. That changed things. Not the facts. The facts were the same, but the feeling. The shame was lifting, replaced by something harder and more useful. Anger. They talked for 2 more hours. Logistics, routes, timing, who had wagons, who could drive them, how much feed they'd need to make the run worthwhile. Celeste took notes. Rowan handled the terrain questions. He knew the mountain pass, the weather patterns, the places where wagons bogged down. Elias, who'd been sitting behind his counter the entire time pretending to do inventory, offered the store as a distribution point. I'm not joining your revolution, he said when Celeste thanked him. I'm offering storage space. There's a difference. Of course, she said. A big difference. Enormous. He gave her the almost smile and went back to pretending to count nails. By 9 o'clock, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan. Celeste didn't trust perfect plans because perfect plans were built by people who hadn't accounted for how messy reality was. But a workable plan. A supply run through the mountain pass in 3 weeks, when the weather would break just enough to make it possible. Rowan would lead. Daniel and Harlan would drive the wagons. Celeste would coordinate the purchasing and the money. Everyone would pay into a collective fund, whatever they could afford, and the savings would be distributed proportionally. It was simple. It was terrifying. And it might work. People left in pairs and small groups, the way people leave a meeting they don't want anyone to know about. Handshakes, nods. Mrs. Clearwater left the rest of the pie. Celeste stood at the store window and watched them disappear into the dark streets of Iron Ridge, and felt, underneath the fear, a stubborn, unreasonable sense of possibility. Rowan was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. You did good tonight, he said. We did good. No, this was you. The numbers, the plan, the way you talked to them, that was all you. He put his hat on. I've been trying to hold this ranch together for 3 years by myself. Breaking my back, losing sleep, selling land, and in 6 weeks, a woman from Boston who can't ride a horse saw what I couldn't. You saw it. You just couldn't prove it. Maybe. He paused at the door. The cold was coming in around him, and she could see his breath in the lamplight. Celeste, if this goes wrong, If Crow comes at us hard, it won't be pretty. He's not going to send Calvin Rhodes with a dinner invitation next time. I know. Do you? Because in Boston, the worst that happens is someone sues you. Out here, barns burn, cattle disappear, people get hurt. I know, she said again. And she did. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, cold and real. But I've already been hurt by a man who thought he owned me. At least this time I'm choosing the fight. He looked at her. The lamplight caught his eyes, gray-green, like sage, like the color of the land he was trying to save. And something passed between them that neither was ready to name. Then he nodded once and walked out into the night. Celeste locked the door behind him, leaned her forehead against the cold wood, breathed. Victor Crow found out about the meeting in less than a week. She never knew who told him. It didn't matter. In a town of 80 people, secrets had the lifespan of a fruit fly. What mattered was what came next. The first sign was small. Elias received a letter from his supplier in Casper, a supplier he'd used for 15 years, informing him that his credit terms were being revised. Effective immediately, cash only. No explanation. Crow, Elias said, reading the letter with the flat expression of a man who had expected this and was disappointed to be right. Can you operate on cash terms? For a while, not forever. Cash means I need more capital up front, which means I need more sales, which means I need more customers, which means I need the town to not be dying. He folded the letter precisely and put it in his pocket. This is the opening move. The second sign came 3 days later. Daniel Clearwater rode into town with a face like a thundercloud and told Celeste that his banknote, which had been on a comfortable repayment schedule for 2 years, had been called in. Full amount. 60 days. The bank manager said it was a routine review, Daniel said. He was standing in the store, dripping melted snow on the floor, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Routine. I've been paying on time for 26 months and suddenly it's a routine review. The bank manager. Is he connected to Crow? Connected. Crow's company is the bank's largest depositor. You think they're going to cross him? The third sign was worse. Harlan Beck's remaining cattle, 32 head, his entire livelihood, broke through a fence during the night and scattered across the open range. By the time he found them, 6 were dead from exposure and 4 were missing. The fence, when he examined it, had been cut, clean cuts, wire snips. Could have been wolves, Sheriff Granger said when Harlan reported it. He said it without looking up from his desk. Wolves don't use wire cutters, Ed. You'd be surprised what wildlife can do. I'll file a report. The report was never filed. Celeste checked. Fear began to seep back into Iron Ridge the way water seeps through cracks. She could feel it in the store, in the way people spoke more quietly, in the way conversations stopped when certain people walked in the way Mrs. Clearwater's visits got shorter and her pies stopped coming. The coalition she'd built in that back room was fracturing, not from disagreement, but from the slow, poisonous pressure that Crow applied the way he applied everything. Indirectly, deniably, and with surgical precision. She went to Rowan on a Tuesday, their Tuesday, and found him sitting on the porch of his house in 20-degree weather, staring at nothing. The supply run, she said. We need to move it up. If we wait 3 weeks, there won't be a coalition left to run it. I know. Can we do it sooner? The pass is still buried, 10 days maybe, if the weather holds. 10 days. It's the best I can do, Celeste. She sat down next to him on the porch. The wood was freezing through her coat. The mountains in the distance were blue-white, impossibly beautiful, indifferent to everything happening beneath them. Harlan's cattle, she said. Daniel's banknote. Elias's credit. It's escalating. I know. Crow's going to come for you next, the broken spur. It's the biggest target. I know that too. So what do we do? Rowan was quiet for a long time. He was looking at his hands, calloused, cracked, the hands of a man who'd been fighting gravity his whole life. I've been thinking about Marnie, he said, his wife's name. He almost never said it. About what she'd say if she could see all this. The meetings, the plans. You. Celeste waited. She'd learned to wait with Rowan, to let silence do its work. She'd say I was an idiot for trying, he said, and then she'd roll up her sleeves and help anyway, because that's who she was. She didn't believe in winning, she believed in trying. He He looked at Celeste. 10 days. I'll start scouting the pass tomorrow. You keep the coalition together. How? Same way you got them in the room in the first place. Tell them the truth. Tell them it's going to get worse before it gets better. And tell them that worse is coming regardless, with or without the supply run, because Crow doesn't stop. She nodded. She wanted to say something about how brave he was, or how much his willingness to fight meant to the people around him. But the words felt too large for the moment, and Rowan wasn't a man who needed to be told things he already knew. Instead, she said, "Your coffee's still terrible, by the way." "I know. Marnie used to make the coffee." It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her. She held it carefully, the way you hold something breakable, and didn't respond. And they sat together on the frozen porch while the light changed and the mountains turned from white to gold to shadow. On the 8th night, 2 days before the supply run, the barn at the Broken Spur caught fire. Celeste was at the store when she saw the glow, a smear of orange against the night sky to the north, flickering and growing, turning the low clouds the color of rust. She knew before she was told. She knew the way the whole town knew, instantly, instinctively, the way animals know earthquake. She took Jack, rode hard, the fastest she'd ever ridden, and she was terrified the whole way. Not of falling, though she might have fallen, but of what she'd find when she arrived. The barn was fully engulfed by the time she got there, flames crawling up the walls, eating the roof, sending columns of sparks into the black sky. The heat was enormous. She could feel it from 50 yards away, pressing against her face like a physical force. Rowan was in the corral, pulling horses out, shouting at his 2 remaining ranch hands to get the cattle moving away from the blaze. His face was lit orange and wild, and she could see the fury in him. Not the collapsed, helpless fury she'd seen before, but something sharper, harder, the fury of a man who has finally been pushed past the point of endurance. She jumped off the horse and ran to help. They worked for an hour, hauling buckets from the trough, wetting blankets, beating out spot fires that jumped to the grass. It was useless. The barn was gone. But they saved the house, and they saved the animals, and they saved each other, which was the only math that mattered. Afterward, they stood in the yard, breathing hard, covered in soot and sweat and the bitter smell of burned wood. The barn was a skeleton of black timbers, still smoldering, still throwing heat. Rowan's hands were burned, not badly, but enough. Celeste's lungs ached from smoke. "The hay supply," Rowan said. His voice was raw. "All of it. Winter feed for the next 2 months. Gone." "Crow?" "Who else?" He kicked a charred plank. It crumbled. "No proof. There'll never be proof. That's the whole game." Daniel Clearwater arrived 20 minutes later, then Harlan, then Tom Birch, then the Jennings in their wagon. Word traveled fast in Iron Ridge, especially when the word was fire. They stood in a ragged circle around the ruins and looked at each other and said very little, because what was there to say? They all knew. They all knew who, and they all knew why. It was Harlan who broke the silence. "Supply runs in 2 days. If we still have people willing to go," Celeste said. "We go," Martha Jennings said. She was standing with her arms crossed, her face hard in the firelight. "We go, because if we don't, this is what happens to every one of us. One barn at a time, one herd at a time, until we've got nothing left and Crow buys us out for pennies." "She's right," Daniel said. "I'm in. My mother's watching the ranch." Harlan nodded. Tom Birch nodded. The ranch hands from the western spread. Their names were Cole and Dutch, and they barely spoke, which made their nods feel somehow more significant. Rowan looked at Celeste. His face was burned orange by the dying fire, streaked with soot, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized from her own mirror on that night in Boston. The moment when fear stops being a reason to stay still and becomes a reason to move. 2 days, he said. "We leave at dawn." The circle tightened. Not physically. Nobody moved. But something contracted, some invisible line drawing them together, binding them to each other and to the decision they'd just made. They were going to fight. Not because they thought they'd win, but because losing while fighting was a different kind of losing than just losing. Celeste watched the embers of the barn drift upward into the night sky, orange sparks against black, rising and dying, and she thought about a woman in a bathroom in Boston, cutting open a suitcase lining with a razor blade. That woman had run. This woman wasn't running. She didn't know if that made her brave or stupid. Probably both. Probably it didn't matter. What mattered was that there were 12 people standing in a burned yard making a choice together, and that was more than any of them had had yesterday. The wind shifted. Smoke blew across the yard, stinging her eyes. She didn't wipe them. She let them water. 2 days. Dawn. The mountain pass. Whatever was coming, they'd meet it together. Dawn came gray and mean, the sky pressing down on the valley like a lid. Celeste hadn't slept. She'd tried, lay on the cot for 3 hours staring at the ceiling, running logistics in her head until the numbers blurred and became faces. Rowan's face, Harlan's, Martha Jennings's. The faces of people who had agreed to follow a plan built by a woman who'd been in Wyoming for 7 weeks and still sometimes put her boots on the wrong feet in the dark. She was dressed and at the store by 4:30. Elias was already there, which meant he hadn't slept either, though he'd never admit it. He had coffee going, real coffee, not the tar he usually served, and he handed her a cup without a word. Elias, don't. Whatever you're about to say, don't. I'm not sentimental and I'm not worried. I'm making coffee because it's cold. I was going to say thank you. I said don't. She drank the coffee. It was good. She didn't tell him that because complimenting Elias was like complimenting a cactus, technically possible but not encouraged. They gathered at the Broken Spur at first light. 3 wagons, 8 riders. Rowan had scouted the pass 2 days before the fire and marked the route with cairns, stacked stones every quarter mile, visible even in poor light. The pass was narrow, steep in places, and still held snow from the last storm, but it was passable. Barely. The kind of barely that left no room for mistakes. Rowan took the lead on horseback. Daniel Clearwater drove the first wagon. Harlan drove the second. Cole, one of the ranch hands, drove the third. Martha Jennings rode alongside. She'd refused to stay behind, and her husband James had stopped arguing about it after she'd pointed out that she could shoot straighter than half the men in town, which was true, and everybody knew it. Celeste rode Jack. Her riding had improved from catastrophic to merely bad, which Elias classified as progress, if you're grading on a curve that includes the dead. She positioned herself near the middle of the caravan, where she could see both the front and the back, because someone needed to keep count of everything, and counting was what she did. They left at 6. The Broken Spur shrank behind them, the house, the ruined barn, the thin cattle. And then it was gone, swallowed by the folds of the land, and they were moving through open country toward the mountains. Nobody talked much for the first hour. The cold discouraged it. So did the tension. Every person in the caravan knew that what they were doing was, at minimum, an act of economic defiance, and at maximum, an invitation for Victor Crow to escalate from barn burning to something worse. The knowledge sat over them like the gray sky, low and heavy and impossible to ignore. It was Harlan who finally broke the silence, shouting from the second wagon. "Hey, Boston, you ever driven through a mountain pass before?" "No," Celeste called back. "You scared?" "Terrified." "Good. Scared people pay attention. It's the brave ones who get themselves killed." This got a laugh from Martha, which got a grunt from Daniel, which got something that might have been a chuckle from Rowan, and just like that the tension cracked. Not broken, but cracked enough to breathe through. The pass was everything Rowan had warned her about. The trail climbed through a gap in the mountains that was barely wide enough for the wagons, with rock walls on both sides and snow packed in drifts that reached the wheel hubs. The horses struggled. The wagon wheels slipped. At one point, the third wagon got stuck in a drift, and it took 40 minutes and every pair of hands to dig it out. Cole swearing steadily the entire time in a creative mix of English and something Celeste didn't recognize. "What language is that?" she asked him, breathing hard, her arms aching from shoveling. "My mother was Norwegian. Does Norwegian have that many swear words?" "More. I'm holding back for the ladies." "Don't hold back on my account," Martha said, and went back to shoveling. They cleared the pass by early afternoon. The descent on the other side was easier. The south-facing slope had less snow, and the trail widened as it dropped toward the Laramie Plain. By 3 o'clock, they could see the town in the distance, a dark cluster against the brown landscape, and Celeste felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since dawn. They'd made it. The first part, at least. the easy part. The supply depot in Laramie was run by a man named George Painter, who Elias had telegraphed the week before. George was short, round, cheerful, and seemed genuinely delighted to have customers from Iron Ridge, which Celeste initially found charming and then found suspicious. "You're Elias's people," George said, pumping Rowan's hand. "He wired me, said you'd been getting fleeced on feed prices. How much you paying per ton through Aldridge?" Rowan told him. George's eyebrows climbed so high they nearly left his face. "That's criminal. Not literally, but it should be. I can do 30% less, easy. 40 if you're buying in bulk." "We're buying in bulk," Celeste said. She produced the collective fund, pooled money from every ranch in the coalition, counted twice and recorded 3 times, because she didn't trust numbers that hadn't been verified. "How much can we get for this?" George did the math. The answer was enough. Enough feed to get the valley through winter, enough lumber for basic repairs, enough medical supplies for the livestock. Not enough for everything. Not enough for comfort or surplus or breathing room, but enough for survival. Enough was a word Celeste had learned to love in Wyoming. In Boston, enough was never enough. Here, enough was the whole game. They loaded the wagons. It took until dusk. Heavy sacks of feed, bales of hay, crates of supplies. The wagons groaned under the weight. The horses eyed the load with visible skepticism. "Can they pull this through the pass?" Celeste asked Rowan. "They'll have to. That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I've got." They camped outside Laramie that night because the pass was too dangerous in the dark. Celeste sat by the fire, wrapped in the sheepskin coat, and watched the others. Harlan telling a story about a bull that had chased him up a tree in '72. Martha heating beans over the fire and telling Harlan his story was a lie, which it probably was. Daniel sitting a little apart, quiet, his face young and worried in the firelight. Cole and Dutch sharing a bottle of something they didn't offer to anyone else, which was fine because nobody wanted it, and Rowan, sitting across the fire from her, not talking, just present. His face lit and shadowed by the flames, the lines of exhaustion and grief softened by the warm light. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something in his eyes that wasn't grief or fury or the guarded blankness he usually wore. It was gratitude. Simple, undecorated, the kind that doesn't need words because words would only shrink it. She looked away first, not because she wanted to, but because the feeling was too large for a campfire and a group of people and the particular fragile moment they were all living in. There would be time. Later. If they survived what was coming. If. They started back at dawn. The return was harder. Loaded wagons, tired horses, and the pass was steeper going north. They lost 2 hours to a drift that had reformed overnight, and another hour to a broken wheel on Harlan's wagon that Cole fixed with wire and profanity. But they made it. They cleared the pass by mid-afternoon and descended into the valley, and Celeste watched Iron Ridge appear in the distance and felt something she hadn't felt since Boston. Not happiness. She'd forgotten what happiness felt like, and she wasn't sure this was it, but satisfaction. The bone-deep satisfaction of having done something difficult and real, something that existed not just in a ledger or a plan, but in the physical world, in the weight of the wagons and the sweat of the horses and the faces of the people around her. They drove into Iron Ridge at 4 o'clock. Elias was standing in front of the store, hands in his pockets, pretending he hadn't been waiting. "You're late," he said. "Wheel broke," Rowan said. Excuses. But he was already helping unload, moving with a speed that contradicted his usual deliberate pace, and Celeste caught him looking at the supplies with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. Word spread fast. By nightfall, ranchers who hadn't been part of the coalition were at the store asking about the prices, the quantities, the route. 2 families who'd stayed out of the Friday meetings showed up with cash in hand, wanting in. 3 more sent word through neighbors. The coalition that had been 13 people in a back room was growing, feeding on something that Crow's intimidation had tried to starve. The possibility of an alternative. For 3 days, it felt like winning. On the 4th day, Crow sent riders. Celeste was at the Broken Spur with Rowan, going over the ranch's books by the kitchen lamp when they heard hoofbeats. Multiple, coming fast from the south. Rowan was at the window before she'd put down the pencil, and what she saw on his face made her stomach drop. How many? She asked. 8, maybe 10. Armed. Crow's men? Who else rides in a group like that after dark? He moved to the rifle rack on the wall, took down a Winchester, checked the load. His movements were calm and practiced, which frightened her more than panic would have. This was a man who had dealt with threats before and expected to deal with them again, and wasn't sure how this one would end. Celeste, get in the back room. No, he turned to her. This isn't a negotiation. You're right. It's not. I'm not hiding in a back room while armed men ride up to this house. I did that in Boston. Let someone else handle things. Stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed safe. And it nearly destroyed me. She stood. Her hands were trembling. She could feel her heart in her throat. But her voice was steady, and that was enough. I'm staying. He looked at her for a long, charged moment. Then he reached behind the rack and pulled out a second rifle. Older, heavier, the stock worn smooth. He held it out to her. You know how to use this? Elias taught me. Sort of. He said I was less dangerous with a gun than without one. I think it was a compliment. Rowan almost laughed. Almost. Stay behind me. Don't shoot unless I shoot. And if things go sideways, you get on Jack and ride to town. Don't argue. Just ride. Rowan, promise me. She took the rifle. It was heavy. I promise, but I'm a terrible liar, so don't hold me to it. The riders arrived in a loose formation, spreading across the yard like a stain. 10 men. Mounted. Most carrying rifles, though none were raised. At the front, on a tall bay horse, was a man Celeste recognized even in the dark. She'd seen him through the saloon window weeks ago. The silver hair, the confident posture, the way the space around him seemed to organize itself into deference. Victor Crow. He stopped his horse 20 yards from the porch. His men fanned out behind him. Nobody spoke for a moment, the kind of silence that isn't empty but loaded, a silence with weight and intention. Evening, Rowan, Crow said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a man who'd come to discuss a business matter, not to intimidate with 10 armed riders at his back. I apologize for the hour. I would have come sooner, but I've been in Casper. What do you want, Victor? A conversation. Just a conversation. Crow's eyes moved to Celeste, found her on the porch, holding the rifle, and stayed there. Miss Mercer, I'm glad to finally meet you in person. I understand my invitation to dinner wasn't to your liking. I hope there are no hard feelings. Your men burned his barn, Celeste said. Her voice came out harder than she expected, harder than she felt. Inside she was shaking, but the words were solid. That's an accusation without evidence. Barns burn, Miss Mercer, especially in winter when stoves get hot and hay gets dry. His voice didn't change, didn't harden, didn't rise. It stayed pleasant, and the pleasantness was the most threatening thing about it. But I didn't come here to discuss barns. I came to make an offer. Not interested, Rowan said. You haven't heard it yet. Don't need to. Crow smiled. It was a real smile, warm, even. The smile of a man who genuinely enjoyed this, who found resistance charming the way a cat finds a mouse charming. Rowan, I understand your pride. I respect it. Your father was the same way. Proud man, hardworking, built this ranch from nothing. I admired him. But pride doesn't pay banknotes, and yours is due in 3 weeks. I'm aware of my own debts. Then you're aware that you're approximately $700 short after the barn fire, after the lost livestock, after the, what shall we call it, supply chain disruption. Your margins are thinner than they've ever been. He wasn't guessing. He had the numbers. Someone had given him the numbers, and Celeste felt a cold wave of nausea as she realized how deeply his network penetrated. I'm offering full market value for the broken spur, all of it. Land, water rights, buildings, stock, enough to clear your debts, set yourself up somewhere comfortable, and start over without the weight of a failing ranch around your neck. It's not failing, you're killing it. That's an opinion. My offer is a fact. Crow leaned forward slightly in the saddle. $2,500. Cash. We can sign papers tomorrow in Casper. You walk away clean. $2,500. Celeste did the math instantly. It was automatic, reflexive, like breathing. The water rights alone were worth 20 times that. The land, even distressed, was worth 5 times the offer. Crow wasn't making a fair deal. He was making a final one. The last move in a long game, time to land when Rowan was weakest, most desperate, most likely to take whatever was offered just to make the pain stop. She knew this play. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. Damien had made her the same kind of offer once. Not money, attention, affection, the promise of stability. Timed perfectly for the moment she was lowest, most isolated, most convinced she couldn't survive without him. It was the predator's gift, the thing that looks like rescue but is actually the last step of the trap. "Don't take it," she said, to Rowan, quietly, but loud enough for Crow to hear. Crow's pleasant expression didn't change, but his eyes did. They shifted to her with a focus that made the hair on her arms stand up. He was seeing her now. Not the woman on the mule, not the bookkeeper, not the nuisance. He was seeing the threat. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I admire what you've done here, truly. Coming all the way from Boston, organizing the locals, running supply through the mountain pass. Impressive for a woman with no ties to this community and no stake in its future." "I have stakes." "Do you?" "Because from where I sit, you look like a woman who ran away from one problem and attached herself to another. And I wonder, when things get difficult, really difficult, whether you'll run again." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, in the soft, bruised place where her deepest fear lived, the fear that he was right, that she was a runner, that when the real pressure came, she would fold the way she'd always folded, and these people who had trusted her would be left holding the wreckage of a plan built by a woman who wasn't strong enough to stay. She felt it, the pull, the old instinct. Go small, go quiet, go away. Let someone else handle it, let someone else fight. You're not built for this. You're not enough. She felt it, and she let it pass through her like wind through an open window. Felt it come, felt it go. And on the other side of it, standing in the space the fear had vacated, was something she hadn't known was there. Not courage. She didn't trust courage. It was too close to recklessness. Something quieter, colder. The simple, stubborn refusal to be moved. "I'm not running," she said, "and neither is he." Crow studied her for a long moment. The fire from the ruined barn had died days ago, but she could swear she saw flames reflected in his eyes. Then he turned back to Rowan. "The offer stands for 1 week. After that, the bank calls the note, and what happens at auction is out of my hands." He gathered his reins. "I hope you'll reconsider, both of you." He turned his horse. His men turned with him, a choreographed movement that spoke to practice and discipline and money. They rode out of the yard, hoofbeats fading south, swallowed by darkness. Rowan and Celeste stood on the porch for a long time after they left. The night was enormous around them. Stars everywhere, hard and bright, the kind of stars you only see when there's nothing between you and the sky. $700, Rowan said. He's right. Even with the supply run savings, I'm still 700 short. I know. I've been working the numbers. And I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. He looked at her. I don't like anything these days. Tell me. The water rights. You've never charged for access because your family never did. But legally, you can. If every rancher who uses water from your spring pays a fair rate, not Crow's rate, a real rate, something they can afford, the revenue covers your banknote with room to spare. You want me to charge my neighbors for water. I want you to charge them a fair price for a resource they depend on, instead of letting Crow take it for free and then charge them 10 times as much. There's a difference between selling something and protecting it. He turned this over. She could see him doing it. The slow, deliberate processing that was how Rowan handled every important decision. Not impulsive, not fast, but thorough. They'll say I'm no better than Crow. Some might, but most of them were in that back room on Friday. They've seen the numbers. They know the alternative is Crow owning the spring and charging whatever he wants. A fair rate from a neighbor they trust, or a gouged rate from a man who burned your barn. That's the choice. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's just not easy. He was quiet. The stars wheeled overhead, slow and indifferent. A coyote called somewhere in the dark, that lonely rising wail, and another answered from a different direction. And for a moment the valley felt alive with invisible things calling to each other across distances too great to cross. Okay, he said, Set up the meetings. I'll talk to them. Rowan. What? He was wrong, Crow. About me running. She paused. I've been running my whole life, from expectations, from Damien, from who I was supposed to be. And I'm tired. I'm so tired of running that standing still feels like the bravest thing I've ever done. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the porch railing. His hand was rough and warm, and it was the first time he'd touched her deliberately, not accidentally, not in the chaos of fighting a fire, but on purpose. A choice. You're not standing still, he said. You're standing your ground. There's a difference. She didn't pull away. She didn't lean in. She just let his hand stay on hers and breathed, and the night breathed with her, cold and vast and full of things that could still go wrong. The meetings happened fast. Celeste rode to every ranch in the valley over the next 4 days, ledger in hand, laying out the water rights proposal with the same methodical clarity she'd used for the supply chain analysis. The numbers were clean, the logic was sound, and the ranchers, most of whom had already seen what organized action could accomplish through the supply run, were more receptive than she'd feared. Not all of them. Walt Briggs, who ran a small spread east of town, refused outright. Paying for water, he said, and spat. Next you'll want me to pay for air. Air doesn't come from a single spring on a single piece of land that Victor Crow is trying to buy, Celeste said. Walt spat again and closed his door. But for every Walt, there were 3 families who said yes, who understood that a small, fair payment to Rowan was insurance against a catastrophic one to Crow, who had, over the past weeks, begun to see themselves not as isolated ranches struggling alone, but as a community with shared interests and shared enemies. The money came in, not all at once. Nobody in Iron Ridge had all of anything at once, but steadily, in envelopes and jars and once in a sock, because Mrs. Clearwater kept her emergency fund in a sock and saw no reason to transfer it to something more dignified. Celeste counted every dollar twice, recorded every payment, issued receipts from a pad she'd bought at the store. By the end of the 4th day, they had it. $732. More than enough to cover Rowan's banknote with a margin for the unexpected. She brought the total to him on a Tuesday, their Tuesday, the rhythm that had somehow become the heartbeat of whatever was growing between them. She set the ledger on the kitchen table and showed him the numbers. He stared at them for a long time. They did this, he said. These people, my neighbors, they did it because you're worth it, because your land is worth it, because this community is worth fighting for. No. They did it because you showed them it was possible, because a woman from Boston who couldn't ride a horse walked into this valley and refused to accept that things were hopeless. He looked up from the ledger. His eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the specific, fierce emotion of a man who has been saved by people he thought he'd lost. Celeste, I don't know how to... Don't. You don't have to say anything. Just pay the banknote before Crow does something else. I'll ride to Casper tomorrow. I'll come with you. I want to see the banker's face when you walk in with cash. He smiled. A real smile. The first one she'd seen from him. Not the almost smile, not the muscle twitch near his eyes, but a full, actual smile that changed his whole face and made him look, for a moment, like the man he'd been before grief and debt and Crow had worn him down. It wasn't a pretty smile. His teeth were slightly crooked and his face was too thin, and the smile lines competed with the worry lines and won by a narrow margin. But it was real, and real was worth more than pretty. Real was worth more than anything she'd left behind. Partners? He said. What? The ranch, the water rights, all of it. I don't want to owe you. I don't want this to be charity or a favor or some debt I carry. I want you to be a partner, equal. Your name on the deed next to mine. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Rowan, that's crazy? Probably. Most good decisions are. He pushed the ledger back toward her. You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch since Marnie. And I'm not saying that because of the money or the plan or the numbers. I'm saying it because you walked into a burning yard with a rifle you barely knew how to use and you didn't leave. That's not a bookkeeper. That's a partner. She looked at him across the table where she'd first spread his financial wreckage and seen, buried in the debt and loss, the outline of something worth saving. Not just the ranch, not just the water rights. The man. The stubborn, grief-worn, quietly furious man who had kept fighting when every rational calculation said to stop. "I'll need my own horse," she said. "A real one, not Patience. Patience will be heartbroken. Patience tried to bite me yesterday. That means she loves you. Your definition of love needs work." He was still smiling, that real smile. And she found herself smiling back, a crooked, imperfect, slightly terrified smile that she hadn't practiced and hadn't planned, and that felt, on her face, like something she'd been missing for a very long time. They rode to Casper the next morning, paid the banknote in full. The banker, a thin man named Prescott, who had the grace to look uncomfortable, stamped the papers and shook Rowan's hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had just been relieved of a problem he'd been dreading. On the ride back, they stopped at the top of the pass and looked down at the valley. Iron Ridge was a dark speck in the distance, tiny against the white landscape, surrounded by ranch land that rolled to every horizon. It looked, from up here, like nothing. A handful of buildings and a few hundred people clinging to frozen ground. Nothing a man like Crow would bother with. Nothing a woman from Boston would cross a continent for. But it was theirs. And that word, theirs, had a weight and a warmth that Celeste hadn't felt in any other word, in any language, in any life she'd lived before this one. They rode down into the valley as the sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of amber and steel, and behind them the pass closed up with shadow, and ahead of them Iron Ridge waited, small and stubborn and alive. And the smoke from Elias's stove rose into the cold air like a signal that someone was home. The banknote was paid, but Victor Crow was not finished. Celeste knew this the way you know a storm hasn't passed, just because the wind drops for a minute. The silence that followed their ride back from Casper was too clean, too complete. Crow's riders didn't come. Calvin Rhodes didn't appear with another invitation. The inflated supply prices from Aldridge's depot went unchanged, but they no longer mattered because the Laramie route was open and functioning. On the surface, it looked like victory. She didn't trust surfaces. She'd married one once. Almost. 3 days after paying the note, she was at the Broken Spur, sitting at the kitchen table that had become her office, her war room, her second home. Rowan was outside with Cole and Dutch, rebuilding the barn, slow, hard work with salvaged timber and new lumber from the Laramie Run. She could hear the rhythmic strike of hammers, the scrape of saws, the occasional burst of Cole's Norwegian profanity when a board didn't cooperate. She was reviewing the water rights agreements she'd drafted for each participating ranch when she heard hoofbeats. Not the thunder of 10 riders, just one horse, moving fast. She went to the window. It was Daniel Clearwater. Riding hard, his horse lathered despite the cold. He pulled up in the yard and dismounted before the animal had fully stopped, which was a thing people only did in this country when the news was bad. "Celeste!" He was at the porch in 3 strides. "Where's Rowan?" "Barn. What happened?" Crow filed a claim in Casper, a legal challenge to the Broken Spur's water rights. He's saying the original deed survey was fraudulent, that the spring actually sits on unclaimed federal land, not Mercer property. He's petitioning the territorial judge to void the water rights and open them for public auction. The words hit her like cold water. She stood in the doorway, the draft cutting through her coat, and felt the specific sinking sensation of watching a chess piece you hadn't anticipated appear on the board. "That's not possible," she said. "I've seen the deed. The survey was filed in 1856 with the territorial office. The spring is clearly within the property boundaries." Crow's got a surveyor from Cheyenne who says otherwise. Filed an affidavit yesterday. The hearing's in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Celeste's mind was already running. Not panicking, running, the way it ran when there were numbers to check and connections to trace. A surveyor from Cheyenne. An affidavit. A territorial judge who played cards at Crow's house. The machinery was different from the financial squeeze. This was legal, official, wearing the costume of legitimate process. But the engineering was the same. Create a crisis. Control the timeline. Force the outcome before the other side can organize a response. Rowan appeared around the corner of the half-built barn, hammer in hand, sawdust in his hair. He'd heard his name. He looked at Daniel's face, then at Celeste's, and set the hammer down with the deliberate care of a man preparing to receive a blow. "Tell me," he said. Daniel told him. Celeste watched Rowan's face go through the stages she'd come to recognize, the tightening, the stillness, the brief flash of something raw underneath, and then settle into the flat granite expression that meant he was past emotion and into calculation. "The original survey," he said. "Where is it?" "Territorial office in Cheyenne," Celeste said, "filed with the original homestead claim." "Then we get it. The original document. If the survey's legitimate, Crow's challenge falls apart. If the judge lets it fall apart. And that's a big if, given who owns the judge. Not owns, influences. There's a difference." Rowan paused. "The judge, Andrew Holt, he's not corrupt. Not exactly. He's in debt to Crow, but he's also a man who cares about his reputation. If we can prove the survey's valid in open court, in front of people with documentation he can't ignore, he'll rule in our favor. He won't risk his career on a fraudulent claim when the evidence is clear." "You know this man?" "My father did. Holt used to ride circuit through Iron Ridge. He came to our house for dinner twice when I was a kid." Rowan's jaw worked. "He's weak, not evil. There's a difference, and it matters." Celeste looked at Daniel. "Can you ride to Cheyenne?" "I can leave tomorrow. Take Harlan with you. 2 witnesses for the document retrieval, in case anyone questions the chain of custody later. And Daniel, don't tell anyone in Cheyenne who sent you or why. Just request a certified copy of the homestead survey for the Broken Spur Ranch, dated 1856. Government records, public access." Daniel nodded and was gone within the hour, riding south with the urgency of a man who understood that the next 2 weeks would determine whether his community survived or scattered. Celeste turned to Rowan. "I need to see every piece of paper your family ever filed. Deeds, tax records, correspondence, anything with the territorial office. Everything. It's in the back room." The back room. The room with the closed door. The room that had been his child's room, with the faded blue paint and the small stars on the walls. She saw the hesitation on his face, a flinch, barely visible, the kind of pain that lives so deep it only surfaces when you brush against the door you've been keeping closed. "I can wait," she said. "If you're not—" "No." He said it quickly, firmly, then softer. "No. It's time." He walked to the door, stood there for a moment with his hand on the knob. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the tension in his neck, and she understood that this was not about documents. This was about a man opening a room he'd sealed shut because everything inside it reminded him of people he couldn't save. He opened the door. She cried until she was empty. Then she washed her face at the pump, dried it on her sleeve, and went back to the table. She wrote her mother back. 1 page. She didn't explain or justify. She told her mother that she was safe, that she was building something, that she was, for the first time in her life, the person she wanted to be rather than the person someone else had designed. She didn't invite her mother to visit. That would come later, maybe. Or maybe not. Some distances can't be closed by a letter or a visit. Some distances are the price of survival, and the price is fair even when it hurts. She sealed the envelope and set it on the table and sat there for a while in the quiet, listening to the life she'd built moving and breathing around her. Fall came. Celeste's first full year in Iron Ridge. The ranch was thriving. Not prosperous. Prosperity was still years away, but alive in a way it hadn't been since before Marnie died. The herd was growing. The water rights agreements generated steady income. The supply chain through Laramie was running like clockwork, and 3 other valleys had adopted the cooperative model. Celeste managed the books. Rowan managed the land. They divided the labor the way partners divide labor. Not equally, because equality is a myth in ranching, but fairly, each taking what they were best at and trusting the other with the rest. Trust. That was the word. Not love. Love was a different conversation, one they were having slowly, in the language of shared meals and quiet evenings, and the gradual, careful dismantling of walls both of them had built. Love would come. Was coming. Was maybe already there, growing in the dark the way things grow in Wyoming, stubbornly, without permission, against all odds. But trust came first, and trust, Celeste had learned, was harder than love and more valuable. Trust meant showing the broken parts, the nights she couldn't sleep, the mornings she flinched, the moments when a certain tone of voice or a certain angle of light sent her back to Boston, back to Damien, back to the version of herself she was still learning to forgive. Rowan saw all of it. He saw it, and he didn't fix it, because it wasn't his to fix, and he didn't ignore it, because ignoring it was a form of disrespect, and he didn't make it about himself, which was the thing that mattered most. He just stayed, present, steady, there, and she did the same for him. For the grief that still lived in the closed room with the blue walls and the small stars. For the days when he went quiet and she knew he was somewhere she couldn't reach, somewhere in the past, with the woman and the child he'd lost. She didn't try to pull him back. She just waited. And eventually he came back on his own, the way people come back from grief. Not all the way, never all the way, but far enough to be here. One evening in October, they sat on the porch of the broken spur and watched the sunset turn the valley gold. The mountains were dark against the sky. The cattle moved slowly in the pasture. Somewhere in town, Elias was closing the store, and Mrs. Clearwater was baking pie. And the Jennings kids were doing whatever Jennings kids did, which was probably something loud and slightly dangerous. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Celeste said. "What?" "That woman in Boston. The one who cut open her suitcase to hide money. I keep thinking about her like she's someone else. Like she's a person I knew once, a long time ago, who I lost touch with. She is someone else. No, she's me. She's still me. That's the part I'm learning. She didn't disappear when I got on the train. She's still here, the fear, the instinct to run, the part of me that checks the road when I hear horses. I thought coming here would fix that. I thought distance was the cure." "It's not?" "No. Distance is just distance. The cure is—" She paused. Thought about it. Really thought, the way she thought about numbers, carefully, looking for the pattern. The cure is building something you'd rather defend than abandon. Something that makes standing still worth more than running. Rowan didn't say anything for a while. He was looking at the valley, at his land, at the ranch his grandfather had claimed and his father had built, and his wife had loved, and he'd nearly lost. His face was calm. Not happy. Calm was better than happy. Calmer lasted longer. And the lines around his eyes looked less like worry and more like weather. The kind of lines you earn from being outside, from facing things, from years of looking at a horizon and choosing every morning to walk toward it. "You know what Elias said about you?" he asked, "the day after you arrived." "I'm afraid to ask." "He said, that woman's going to either save this town or burn it down, and I give it even odds." Celeste laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and surprises you because you'd forgotten what it sounded like. "He said that?" Direct quote. I remember because it was the longest sentence I'd heard from him in 3 years. "And which one do you think I did?" "Both." He looked at her. That gray-green gaze. Sage, the color of the land. "You burned down everything that wasn't working and saved everything that was. That's not a contradiction. That's just how building works." She leaned against his shoulder. Not dramatically, not like a movie. Just leaned, the way tired people lean on things that are solid. And he put his arm around her, and they sat there on the porch as the light died and the stars came out. Those hard, bright Wyoming stars that she'd been afraid of her first night on the cot in the storeroom and that she now thought of as the most honest things in the world. Cold, distant, indifferent, but always there. Always exactly where they said they'd be. She thought about the woman in the bathroom, about the train, about Patience the mule and Elias's terrible coffee, and the mountain pass in February, and the barn burning, and the courtroom in Casper, and the 30-odd people who had stood in that room, saying nothing, meaning everything. She thought about the word freedom, how she'd misunderstood it for most of her life. She'd thought freedom was the absence of constraint. No Damien, no expectations, no cage. But that wasn't it. That was just emptiness. Real freedom was the presence of choice, the ability to look at a hard thing and a harder thing and pick the one that meant something. The ability to stay when staying was terrifying, the ability to build when building might fail. The ability to love when loving meant risking the only thing you'd managed to save, yourself. She didn't say any of this out loud. She didn't need to. Rowan knew. Elias knew. The whole valley knew, in the way communities know things. Not through words, but through witness. They'd watched a woman arrive with nothing and build something. Not perfectly, not easily. Not without mistakes and fear and the occasional public argument with a mule. But real. Hers, theirs. The night settled. The temperature dropped. The wind came, the way it always came in Wyoming. from somewhere vast, carrying cold and distance and the smell of spaces too big to imagine. Celeste Mercer sat on the porch of a ranch she co-owned in a valley she'd helped save, beside a man she was learning to love. And she was not running. She was not hiding. She was not performing a version of herself designed by someone else. She was just there, present. In the cold, under the stars, in a place that had tried to kill her and instead became the first place that felt like home. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.